Before the Arctic had a name, they came. From the windswept steppes of Siberia to the frozen edges of the North American Arctic, their journey began over 4,000 years ago. Across the Bering Land Bridge, the first Paleo-Eskimo peoples ventured into an unforgiving world of ice, forging survival where none seemed possible. From this struggle emerged the Pre-Dorset culture, humanity's earliest known footsteps in the high Arctic. The Pre-Dorset culture, also known as the Arctic small tool tradition, represents the earliest confirmed human presence in the high Arctic, dating from approximately 2,500 to 500 BCE. Who were they? How did they endure? And what secrets still lie beneath the eternal ice? This is the untold origin of the Inuit. These pioneering groups emerged from the broader Paleoarctic tradition and carried with them a distinctive toolkit that would define Arctic survival for millennia. Their stone implements were remarkably small and precisely crafted, microblades, burins and scrapers that rarely exceeded a few centimeters in length. These tools, found scattered across archaeological sites from Alaska to Greenland, tell the story of a people who had mastered the art of working with limited raw materials in an environment where every resource was precious. Pre-Dorset settlements reveal a nomadic lifestyle centered around seasonal hunting camps. At sites like Independence's one in northern Greenland, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of tent rings, circular arrangements of stones that once anchored skin dwellings against Arctic winds. The inhabitants of these camps pursued musk oxen, caribou and seals with sophisticated hunting strategies that required intimate knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal patterns. Their harpoon heads, carved from antler and bone, featured elegant barbed designs that ensured wounded prey could not escape. The precision of these tools speaks to generations of accumulated knowledge about Arctic survival. The genetic signature of these Arctic peoples can still be traced in modern populations. DNA analysis reveals that Pre-Dorset groups carried markers linking them to Siberian populations, particularly those from the Chukchi Peninsula and surrounding regions. This connection extends beyond genetics to include linguistic relationships, with Proto-Eskimo Aleut languages showing clear ties to certain Siberian language families, though the exact nature of these relationships remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Around 500 BCE, the Pre-Dorset tradition gave way to the Dorset culture, a more sophisticated and technologically advanced society that would dominate the Arctic for over a millennium. The Dorset people, known to the later Inuit as the Tunit or Sivulik, developed innovations that allowed them to thrive in environments their predecessors had found marginal. They perfected the construction of snow houses, created elaborate ice fishing techniques, and developed a complex spiritual culture that included carved ivory figurines and shamanic practices. Dorset sites across the Arctic reveal a people who had achieved remarkable adaptation to their environment. At Igloolik in Nunavut, excavations have uncovered sophisticated winter settlements featuring semi-subterranean houses with carefully engineered ventilation systems. These structures, built partially into the ground and covered with stone, bone and hide, could maintain comfortable temperatures even when outside conditions dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The inhabitants heated these dwellings with seal oil lamps made from soapstone, carved into shallow bowls with carefully shaped wicks that provided both warmth and light during the long Arctic winter. The Dorset hunting technology represented a significant advancement over their predecessors. They developed toggling harpoon heads that would turn sideways once embedded in prey, making escape virtually impossible. The ice fishing gear included sophisticated leasters, multi-pronged spears perfect for catching Arctic char through breathing holes. Perhaps most remarkably, they created the first true Arctic watercraft, building kayaks and larger umiak boats that allowed them to hunt marine mammals in open water. Dorset artistic expression reveals a rich spiritual life centered around the relationship between humans and animals. Carved ivory amulets, depicting polar bears, seals and walruses, have been found throughout their territory, often showing intricate detail that suggests both artistic skill and deep spiritual significance. Some carvings show human-animal transformations, indicating shamanic beliefs about the fluid boundary between human and animal worlds. These artifacts provide glimpses into a sophisticated belief system that helped the Dorset people make sense of their challenging environment. The end of Dorset dominance came not through environmental catastrophe or internal collapse, but through the arrival of a new and more technologically advanced people from the West. Around 900 CE, the Thule culture began expanding eastward from Alaska, bringing with them innovations that would revolutionize Arctic life. The Thule expansion represents one of the most rapid and successful colonizations in human history, covering over 5,000 kilometers in just a few centuries. The Thule people possessed technological advantages that made them formidable competitors for Arctic resources. Most significantly, they had developed sophisticated techniques for hunting large whales, particularly bowhead whales that could provide enough food, fuel and raw materials to support substantial communities through entire winters. Their whaling technology included large skin boats called umiaks, capable of carrying crews of automore hunters and heavy toggling harpoons designed to penetrate thick whale hide and blubber. Archaeological evidence from Thule sites reveals the scale of their whaling success. At locations like Point Hope, Alaska, and Resolute Bay in the Canadian Arctic, researchers have uncovered whalebone houses, structures built using the massive jawbones and ribs of bowhead whales as architectural elements. These houses, some measuring over 10 meters in length, could shelter extended families and their possessions through the harshest Arctic winters. The abundance of whalebone at these sites indicates that Thule hunters were taking multiple large whales each season, a feat that required sophisticated coordination and planning. The Thule expansion coincided with a period of climatic warming known as the Medieval Warm Period, which lasted roughly from 900 to 1300 CE. During this time, sea ice coverage was reduced, making whale hunting more feasible and opening previously inaccessible areas to human settlement. The warming climate also meant that traditional Dorset hunting grounds became less reliable as changing ice conditions affected seal populations and migration patterns. Genetic studies have revealed that the Thule people were the direct ancestors of modern Inuit populations. DNA analysis shows clear continuity between Thule remains and contemporary Inuit communities across the Arctic. This genetic evidence is supported by linguistic data, as all modern Inuit dialects can be traced back to Proto-Thule languages, spoken during the expansion period. The remarkable consistency of Inuit languages across thousands of kilometers of territory reflects the relatively recent and rapid nature of the Thule expansion. The relationship between expanding Thule populations and existing Dorset communities remains a subject of archaeological investigation. Evidence suggests that in some areas, the two groups coexisted for several generations. At sites in the central Canadian Arctic, researchers have found mixed assemblages containing both Dorset and Thule artifacts, indicating some form of interaction or cultural exchange. However, The overall pattern shows Dorset populations declining as Thule groups established themselves in traditional hunting territories. Thule technological superiority extended beyond whaling to include innovations in transportation, housing, and tool manufacture. They developed the classic dog sled, using teams of specially bred Arctic dogs to transport goods and people across vast distances. Their sleds, constructed with flexible lashings that could withstand the stress of rough ice travel, allowed for rapid movement between seasonal hunting grounds. The dogs themselves represented a crucial technology. Genetic analysis shows that Thule dogs were specifically adapted for Arctic conditions, with thick coats, efficient metabolism and strong social bonds that made them ideal working partners. The tool also perfected the construction of semi-subterranean winter houses that were more sophisticated than earlier Dorset structures. These dwellings featured entrance tunnels that trapped cold air below the main living space, sophisticated drainage systems to handle melting ice, and carefully planned storage areas for food, tools and materials. The largest Thule houses could accommodate multiple families and included specialized work areas for tool manufacture, hide preparation, and other essential activities. Thule expansion into Greenland occurred around 1200 CE, bringing these accomplished Arctic hunters into contact with Norse settlers who had established colonies on the island's southwestern coast. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Ruin Island settlement in northwest Greenland shows that Thule groups quickly adapted to local conditions, developing specialized hunting techniques for the region's unique marine mammal populations. The success of Thule expansion can be attributed to their flexible social organization and sophisticated knowledge systems. Unlike their predecessors, who appear to have lived in small, relatively isolated groups, Thule communities maintained extensive trade and communication networks spanning thousands of kilometers. Raw materials like copper from the central Canadian Arctic, meteoric iron from northwest Greenland, and specialized toolstone from various quarries moved along these networks, allowing communities to access resources unavailable in their immediate territories. Thule environmental knowledge represented the culmination of thousands of years of Arctic adaptation. They understood ice conditions with extraordinary precision, reading subtle signs that indicated safe travel routes, good hunting prospects, and weather changes. Their knowledge of animal behavior allowed them to predict migration patterns, locate denning sites, and time hunting activities for maximum success. This accumulated wisdom was transmitted through complex oral traditions that included detailed geographical knowledge, hunting techniques, and spiritual practices. The linguistic evidence for Thule expansion provides additional insights into this remarkable colonization. Proto-Inuit, the ancestral language of all modern Inuit dialects, can be reconstructed through comparative analysis of contemporary languages. This reconstruction reveals a vocabulary rich in terms for sea ice conditions, weather patterns, and marine mammal behavior, reflecting the maritime focus of Thule culture. The rapid spread of this language family across the Arctic demonstrates the speed and thoroughness of Thule expansion. Modern genetic studies have revealed a broader context of Arctic peoples within global human migration patterns. Inuit populations show clear relationships to Arctic groups, including the Yupik peoples of Alaska and Siberia, and the Aleut of the Aleutian Islands. These relationships reflect ancient connections dating back to the initial peopling of the Arctic, but also more recent gene flow between neighboring populations. The Yupik peoples, who remained primarily in Alaska and eastern Siberia, represent the closest genetic relatives of the Inuit. Their languages belong to the same Eskimo Aleut family, and archaeological evidence suggests that Yupik and Proto-Inuit populations shared common ancestors as recently as 2,000 years ago. The separation between these groups appears to coincide with the Thule expansion as Proto-Inuit populations moved eastward, while Yupik groups remained in their traditional territories. Aleut populations show more distant relationships to Inuit groups, reflecting an earlier divergence within the Eskimo Aleut language family. Genetic evidence suggests that the ancestors of the Aleut separated from other Arctic peoples around 4,000 years ago, developing their own distinctive adaptations to the marine environment of the Aleutian Islands. Despite this early separation, Aleut and Inuit cultures share fundamental similarities in their maritime orientation and sophisticated understanding of Arctic and subarctic marine ecosystems. The technological innovations that enabled successful Arctic colonization developed over thousands of years through continuous adaptation and refinement. The evolution of Arctic hunting technology shows a clear progression from the simple tools of the Pre-Dorset, through the sophisticated equipment of the Thule, each innovation built upon previous knowledge while responding to specific environmental challenges and opportunities. Clothing technology represents one of the most crucial adaptations for Arctic survival. Archaeological evidence shows that even the earliest Arctic peoples had developed sophisticated clothing systems using multiple layers of carefully prepared animal skins. Thule clothing reached extraordinary levels of refinement, with parkas designed to provide insulation while allowing freedom of movement, waterproof outer garments for marine hunting and specialized footwear for different ice and snow conditions. The development of Arctic architecture followed similar patterns of continuous innovation. From the simple tent rings of Pre-Dorset camps to the elaborate whalebone houses of Thule villages, each culture developed building techniques suited to their specific needs and available materials. The invention of the snow house, perfected by Dorset peoples and refined by the Thule, represented a breakthrough that allowed for comfortable temporary shelter anywhere sufficient snow was available. The sophisticated technological achievements that enabled Thule expansion across the Arctic were matched by equally complex social structures and cultural practices that bound communities together across vast distances. Traditional Inuit society operated through intricate networks of kinship, reciprocity, and shared responsibility that ensured survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. These social arrangements were not merely practical necessities, but reflected deep philosophical understandings about human relationships, environmental stewardship, and spiritual obligations that had evolved over countless generations. Kinship formed the fundamental organizing principle of Inuit society, creating webs of obligation and support that extended far beyond the nuclear family. The Inuit kinship system was bilateral, meaning that relationships were traced through both maternal and paternal lines, creating multiple overlapping networks of relatives with specific roles and responsibilities. Children belonged equally to both parents' extended families, giving them access to diverse hunting territories, specialized knowledge and social support across wide geographical areas. The naming system reinforced these kinship bonds while connecting the living to ancestral wisdom. Inuit children typically received names from recently deceased relatives, creating a form of spiritual continuity that linked generations. A child named after a grandmother would be treated with special respect by that grandmother's contemporaries and would be expected to embody certain characteristics associated with the deceased. This naming practice meant that social relationships extended beyond biological connections to include spiritual and cultural inheritance. Extended families formed the core economic and social units of traditional Inuit society. These groups, typically consisting of 15 to 30 individuals spanning 3 or 4 generations, shared hunting territories, coordinated seasonal movements and pooled resources during times of scarcity. The eldest members provided leadership based on their accumulated knowledge of weather patterns, animal behavior and territorial boundaries, while younger adults conducted most hunting and gathering activities. Children and adolescents learned through constant observation and gradual participation in adult activities. Marriage arrangements reflected the practical needs of Arctic survival while maintaining kinship networks across different regions. Young people typically married outside their immediate extended family, but within established alliance networks that connected different hunting groups. These marriages created new pathways for resource sharing and information exchange, as spouses brought knowledge of different territories, hunting techniques and spiritual practices to their new families. Polygamy was practiced in some regions, particularly when successful hunters could support multiple wives and their children, but monogamy was more common due to the economic challenges of Arctic life. Seasonal camps represented the primary social and economic organization above the extended family level. These temporary settlements brought together multiple related families during specific hunting seasons, creating communities of 50 to 200 people who coordinated their activities around shared resources. Summer camps typically formed near good fishing locations or along caribou migration routes, while winter camps were established in areas with reliable seal hunting or access to cached food supplies. The internal organization of seasonal camps reflected egalitarian principles that emphasized competence and contribution over hereditary status. Leadership emerged naturally from demonstrated expertise in hunting, weather prediction, or conflict resolution, rather than formal appointment or inheritance. Successful hunters gained influence through their ability to provide for others, but this influence was contingent on continued success and generous sharing of resources. No individual or family could claim permanent authority over others, and decisions affecting the entire camp were made through informal consensus-building processes. Resource sharing within camps operated through complex systems of reciprocity that ensured no family went without necessities, while rewarding successful hunters and skilled craftspeople. When a hunter killed a large marine mammal, specific portions were distributed according to traditional protocols that recognized the contributions of different community members. The hunter's family received choice cuts, but substantial portions went to elders, families with young children, and individuals who had provided assistance during the hunt. This sharing system created social bonds that transcended immediate family relationships, while providing insurance against the inevitable fluctuations in individual hunting success. The spiritual beliefs that guided traditional Inuit society were rooted in animistic understanding of the natural world, where all beings possessed souls and consciousness that demanded respect and proper treatment. This worldview saw humans as participants in a complex web of relationships with animal spirits, weather phenomena, and landscape features, each with their own agency and requirements for maintaining harmony. The success of hunting, the safety of travel, and the health of communities depended on maintaining proper relationships with these spiritual forces through careful observance of taboos, rituals, and ethical behavior. Inua, the concept of indwelling spirits, formed the foundation of Inuit spiritual understanding. Every animal, natural feature, and even manufactured object possessed an Inua that gave it consciousness and power. The Inua of seals, for example, were believed to observe how hunters treated their physical bodies after death, rewarding respectful treatment with future hunting success and punishing carelessness with empty hunting trips. This belief system created detailed protocols for handling game animals, from the moment of death through the consumption of meat and the disposal of bones and other remains. Shamanic practitioners, known as Inuit, served as intermediaries between human communities and the spirit world, using their specialized knowledge and supernatural abilities to diagnose illnesses, predict weather patterns, and resolve conflicts that threatened community harmony. These individuals underwent lengthy training that included periods of isolation, fasting, and spiritual instruction from established shamans. Their abilities were believed to include soul travel to other worlds, communication with animal spirits, and the power to heal physical and spiritual ailments through ritual intervention. The training of shamans involved acquiring helping spirits, often through vision quests or dreams that occurred during periods of physical and emotional stress. These spirits, which might take the form of animals, deceased ancestors, or supernatural beings, provided the shaman with powers and knowledge. A shaman might have a polar bear spirit that granted strength and courage, a raven spirit that provided foresight and prophecy, or an ancestor spirit that offered wisdom about traditional practices and taboos. Shamanic rituals addressed both individual and community needs through elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. Healing rituals involved the states to locate lost souls, extract harmful spiritual intrusions, or negotiate with offended spirits on behalf of patients. Weather magic attempted to influence wind patterns, ice conditions, and storm systems that affected hunting and travel. Community rituals addressed collective problems such as poor hunting, social conflicts, or violations of important taboos that threatened group welfare. The performance of shamanic rituals involved distinctive clothing, tools, and techniques that marked the practitioner's special status and spiritual power. Shamanic parkas often featured distinctive decorative elements, including amulets, carved ivory ornaments, and symbolic patterns that represented the shaman's helping spirits. Drums made from caribou hide stretched over wooden frames provided rhythmic accompaniment that helped induce trance states and called spiritual helpers. The drumming, combined with repetitive chanting and dancing, created altered states of consciousness that enabled communication with the spirit world. Taboos formed an essential component of traditional spiritual practice, creating detailed behavioral codes that regulated human interactions with the natural world. These prohibitions covered virtually every aspect of daily life, from hunting techniques and food preparation to clothing manufacture and seasonal activities. Some taboos were universal across Inuit communities, such as prohibitions against mixing sea and land mammal products, while others were specific to particular regions or family groups. The taboo system governing hunting activities was particularly elaborate, reflecting the critical importance of maintaining proper relationships with animal spirits. Hunters were required to observe specific rituals before, during, and after hunting trips, including purification ceremonies, offerings to animal spirits, and careful treatment of hunting equipment. The weapons used to kill different animals could not be mixed or used for inappropriate purposes, and the processing of game animals followed strict protocols that ensured respectful treatment of the animal's Inuit. Seasonal taboos regulated activities according to the natural cycles that governed Arctic life. During the dark winter months, certain activities were prohibited to avoid disturbing the spiritual forces that controlled the return of sunlight. Spring taboos protected the renewal of life by restricting activities that might interfere with animal reproduction or plant growth. These seasonal restrictions created rhythms of activity and restraint that synchronized human behavior with natural cycles. Violations of important taboos were believed to cause individual misfortune and community-wide problems, including poor hunting, severe weather, and epidemic illness. When such problems occurred, shamans would conduct divination rituals to identify the specific transgression and prescribe appropriate remediation. This might involve public confession by the offender, ritual purification of the entire community, or elaborate ceremonies designed to appease offended spirits. Oral traditions served as the primary mechanism for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations, encompassing everything from practical survival skills to complex spiritual teachings. These traditions included multiple categories of verbal art, each with specific functions and performance contexts. Historical narratives preserved knowledge about past events, territorial boundaries, and genealogical relationships. Instructional stories taught practical skills such as hunting techniques, weather prediction, and tool manufacture. Spiritual narratives explained the origins of natural phenomena, the proper relationships between humans and spirits, and the consequences of violating traditional taboos. The performance of oral traditions was governed by seasonal and social protocols that determined when different types of stories could be told and who was authorized to tell them. Many traditional narratives could only be recited during the dark winter months when communities gathered in close quarters and had time for extended storytelling sessions. Certain stories were restricted to specific audiences, with some reserved for adults and others designed specifically for children's instruction. The most sacred narratives could only be told by recognized experts who had earned the right through years of apprenticeship and demonstrated mastery of traditional knowledge. Storytelling sessions served multiple functions beyond entertainment, creating opportunities for community bonding, educational instruction, and spiritual reflection. The shared experience of listening to familiar narratives reinforced cultural values and social relationships while providing frameworks for understanding individual and collective experiences. Children learned proper behavior through stories that illustrated the consequences of various actions, while adults used narrative sessions to debate appropriate responses to current challenges by referencing traditional precedents. The accuracy of oral transmission was maintained through various mechanisms including formulaic language, repetitive structures, and community verification of narrative details. Important stories were told in standardized forms that included specific phrases, character descriptions, and plot sequences that remained consistent across different performances. Experienced storytellers were expected to maintain these traditional forms while adapting their presentation to specific audiences and circumstances. Memory techniques used by traditional storytellers included association with geographical landmarks, seasonal activities, and familiar objects that helped organize complex narrative sequences. Stories were often linked to specific locations where events were supposed to have occurred, creating mental maps that connected narrative knowledge to territorial familiarity. Seasonal references helped organize stories according to the annual cycle of activities, while references to tools, animals, and daily activities provided concrete anchors for abstract concepts. Traditional arts and crafts represented sophisticated forms of cultural expression that combined aesthetic beauty with practical functionality while serving as markers of cultural identity and spiritual belief. These artistic traditions encompassed a wide range of media, including carved ivory, worked stone, prepared skins, and metal objects that demonstrated both technical mastery and creative imagination. The creation of these objects was governed by traditional protocols that specified appropriate materials, techniques, and decorative motifs while allowing for individual creativity and innovation. Ivory carving represented one of the most highly developed Inuit art forms, utilizing walrus tusks, narwhal tusks, and whalebone to create objects ranging from practical tools to elaborate ceremonial items. The carving process required extensive technical knowledge about the properties of different materials, appropriate tools and techniques, and traditional design principles. Carvers needed to understand how ivory aged and changed color, how different carving techniques affected surface texture, and how to work around natural flaws and irregularities in raw materials. The subject matter of ivory carvings reflected the close relationship between Inuit communities and Arctic wildlife, with representations of seals, walruses, polar bears, and whales appearing frequently in both utilitarian and decorative contexts. These animal representations were not merely artistic choices, but carried spiritual significance related to hunting success, protection from danger, and communication with animal spirits. Carved amulets depicting specific animals were believed to transfer the characteristics of those animals to their owners, providing strength, speed, or hunting ability as needed. Human figures in ivory carvings often depicted shamanic themes, including transformation scenes where human and animal characteristics were combined in single figures. These transformation images reflected spiritual beliefs about the fluid boundaries between human and animal consciousness, and the shaman's ability to assume animal forms during spiritual journeys. The artistic representation of these concepts required sophisticated understanding of both human and animal anatomy, as well as the symbolic vocabulary used to represent spiritual concepts. The tools used for ivory carving were themselves works of craftsmanship, including various knives, scrapers, and drilling implements made from steel, stone, and bone materials. The quality of these tools directly affected the precision and detail possible in finished carvings, leading to continuous refinement of toolmaking techniques. Carvers often made their own tools according to personal preferences and specialized needs, creating implements that reflected individual working styles and technical approaches. Skin sewing represented another highly developed craft tradition that combined practical necessity with artistic expression through the creation of clothing, containers, and shelter materials. The preparation of animal skins for sewing required extensive knowledge of skinning techniques, curing processes, and treatment methods that varied according to the intended use of the finished product. Seal skins used for waterproof clothing required different preparation than caribou hides used for winter parkas, and the success of the entire process depended on careful attention to step. The sewing techniques used in traditional skin work included various stitching methods designed for specific functions and materials. Waterproof seams used in kayak construction and rain gear required specialized stitching that prevented water penetration while maintaining flexibility and strength. Decorative stitching used in parka trim and ceremonial clothing combined functional requirements with aesthetic considerations, creating patterns that identified the maker's cultural background and artistic skill. Traditional clothing design reflected sophisticated understanding of Arctic environmental conditions and human physiological needs, creating garment systems that provided effective insulation while allowing freedom of movement. The classic Inuit parka incorporated multiple design features including adjustable hoods, ventilation systems, and specialized pocket arrangements that addressed specific functional requirements. The cut and fit of these garments reflected generations of refinement based on practical experience and user feedback. Decorative elements in traditional clothing included fur trim, beadwork, and applique designs that served both aesthetic and symbolic functions. These decorative features identified the wearer's cultural background, family affiliations, and social status while demonstrating the skill and creativity of the garment maker. The choice of decorative materials and patterns followed traditional protocols that specified appropriate designs for different types of clothing and social occasions. Drum dancing represented a central form of cultural expression that combined music, movement, and storytelling in community performances that served both entertainment and spiritual functions. Traditional drums were constructed from caribou hide stretched over wooden frames, creating instruments capable of producing a wide range of tones and rhythmic patterns. The construction of these drums required careful selection of materials and precise craftsmanship to achieve the desired sound quality and durability. The performance of drum dancing involved complex choreography that coordinated individual movements with musical rhythms and narrative content. Dancers used their entire bodies to express the emotional content of songs while maintaining precise timing with the drum accompaniment. The movements often mimicked animal behaviors or natural phenomena referenced in the song lyrics, creating visual representations that enhanced the narrative impact of the performance. Traditional drum songs encompassed various categories including personal songs that expressed individual experiences and emotions, hunting songs that celebrated successful expeditions or called for good fortune, and ceremonial songs used in spiritual rituals and community celebrations. The composition of new songs followed traditional structural patterns while allowing for individual creativity and contemporary relevance. Accomplished song composers were recognized for their eros ability to create memorable melodies and meaningful lyrics that resonated with community experiences. Throat singing represented another distinctive form of Inuit musical expression, typically performed by pairs of women who created complex rhythmic and tonal patterns through controlled breathing and vocal techniques. This performance style required extensive practice and coordination between partners who matched their breathing patterns and vocal productions to create harmonious effects. The songs often incorporated imitations and natural sounds including wind patterns, animal calls and water movements. The social context of throat singing included both informal entertainment and formal competition, with accomplished performers gaining recognition for their technical skill and creative interpretation. These performances served as social bond and activities that brought women together while providing opportunities for artistic expression and cultural transmission. Young women learned throat singing techniques through observation and practice with experienced performers who passed on traditional songs along with performance techniques. The cultural foundations and social structures that bound traditional Inuit communities together were inseparable from the sophisticated technologies that made Arctic survival possible. Every aspect of daily life required specialized knowledge and precisely crafted tools that had been refined through countless generations of trial and error. The margin for failure in the Arctic was razor thin, making technological mastery a matter of life and death rather than mere convenience. The hunting technologies, shelter systems and survival strategies developed by Inuit peoples represent some of humanity's most impressive adaptations to extreme environmental conditions. Marine mammal hunting formed the cornerstone of Inuit subsistence across most of the Arctic, requiring an intricate understanding of animal behavior, ice conditions and weather patterns that took decades to master. Seal hunting dominated winter activities, with ringed seals providing the most reliable source of meat, oil and materials throughout the dark months. These seals maintained breathing holes through sea ice that could reach several meters in thickness, creating opportunities for hunters who possessed the patience and skill to exploit this behavior. The technique of seal hole hunting, known as Moloch Tuck, demanded extraordinary patience and precise timing. Hunters would locate active breathing holes by reading subtle signs in the ice surface, including frost patterns around the opening and the presence of seal hair caught on ice edges. Once a promising hole was identified, the hunter would construct a small windscreen from snow blocks and settle into a motionless vigil that could last for hours. The slightest movement or sound would alert the seal and ruin the hunting opportunity, requiring hunters to develop remarkable physical endurance and mental discipline. The harpoon used for seal hunting represented centuries of technological refinement, incorporating multiple components that work together to ensure successful capture of wounded animals. The harpoon head, carved from walrus ivory or antler, featured a sharp stone or metal point attached to a toggling mechanism that would turn sideways once embedded in the seal's body. This toggle prevented the wounded animal from escaping, while a long sinew connected the harpoon head to a wooden shaft that the hunter could retrieve after the strike. The construction of these harpoons required precise knowledge of materials and their properties under Arctic conditions. The wooden shaft, typically made from driftwood or imported timber, needed to be straight and balanced while remaining flexible enough to absorb the shock of impact. The sinew line had to be strong enough to hold a struggling seal while remaining supple in freezing temperatures. The lashing that attached various components used specially prepared strips of seal skin that would not stretch or break under stress. Spring seal hunting employed different techniques that took advantage of changing ice conditions and seal behavior during the reproductive season. As daylight returned and temperatures rose, seals began hauling out onto the ice surface to bask in the sun near their breathing holes. This behavior created opportunities for hunters to approach within harpoon range by using the aglow hunting method, which involved patient stalking across the ice surface. Successful aglow hunting required intimate knowledge of wind direction, ice conditions, and seal behavior patterns. Hunters approached their quarry by crawling across the ice, using natural features and snow formations for concealment while remaining constantly alert to changes in the seal's posture that might indicate alarm. The final approach required split-second timing, as the hunter had only moments to rise from concealment, aim, and throw the harpoon before the seal could escape into its breathing hole. Walrus hunting represented the most dangerous and technically demanding form of marine mammal hunting, requiring coordinated group efforts and specialized equipment capable of handling animals that could weigh over 1,500 kilograms. These massive pinnipeds possessed formidable tusks and aggressive temperaments that made them extremely dangerous adversaries, particularly when protecting their young or defending hauling out sites on ice floes or rocky beaches. The approach to walrus hunting grounds required careful planning and precise execution, as these animals were highly intelligent and would flee at the first sign of human presence. Hunting parties traveled in large skin boats called umiaks, which could carry crews of 8 to 12 hunters, along with their specialized equipment. These boats needed to be maneuvered close enough to the walrus herd for harpoon strikes while remaining ready for immediate retreat if the animals charged, or the ice conditions changed suddenly. Walrus harpoons were substantially larger and stronger than those used for seals, featuring heavy wooden shafts up to 3 meters in length and massive toggle heads capable of penetrating thick walrus hide and blubber. The harpoon lines used heavy walrus hide rope that could withstand the tremendous forces generated by a wounded walrus attempting to escape. Multiple harpoons were typically required to secure a single animal, with different hunters taking turns to strike while others managed the lines and maneuvered the boat. The processing of a successfully killed walrus required the entire hunting crew and could take many hours of intensive labor. The massive carcass had to be butchered systematically, with specific portions allocated according to traditional sharing protocols that recognized each hunter's contribution to the success. The valuable tusks were carefully removed and would later be carved into tools, weapons, and artistic objects. The thick hide provided material for boat covers, rope and other heavy-duty applications that required exceptional strength and durability. Whaling represented the pinnacle of Inuit hunting technology and social organization, requiring large crews, specialized equipment and extensive preparation that could take months to complete. Bowhead whales, the primary target species, could reach lengths of over 18 meters and weights exceeding 100 tons, making them the largest prey animals pursued by any traditional hunting society. The successful capture of a single whale could provide enough food, fuel and materials to sustain an entire community through multiple seasons. The construction of whaling umiaks required master craftsmen who understood the complex engineering principles needed to create boats capable of handling the stresses of whale hunting. These vessels measured up to 12 meters in length and were built using driftwood or imported timber frames covered with specially prepared walrus or bearded seal hides. The frame construction used sophisticated joinery techniques that allowed the boat to flex with wave action while maintaining structural integrity under extreme conditions. Whaling crews consisted of specialized roles that reflected years of training and accumulated expertise. The umiak or boat captain served as the expedition leader and was typically an experienced hunter who owned the boat and equipment. The harpooner occupied the position of honor at the bow and was responsible for delivering the critical first strike that would begin the whale capture process. Other crew members handled the boat, managed harpoon lines and provided backup harpoons as needed during the hunt. The whaling season required extensive preparation that began months before the actual hunting period. Crews spent weeks preparing their equipment, including sharpening harpoon points, checking boat seams and testing all rope and line connections. The harpoons used for whaling were massive implements featuring heavy wooden shafts, large toggle heads and specially braided lines that could handle the enormous forces generated by a struck whale attempting to escape. The whale hunt itself was an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking that required precise coordination and split-second timing. The crew had to maneuver their boat close enough to the whale for a harpoon strike while avoiding the animal's powerful tail flukes, which could destroy the boat and kill the entire crew with a single blow. Once struck, the whale would typically sound, diving deep and pulling the boat at tremendous speeds across the water surface in what was known as a Nantucket sleigh ride. Caribou hunting required entirely different skills and technologies adapted to terrestrial rather than marine environments. These large deer migrated in vast herds across the Arctic tundra following ancient routes that connected calving grounds, summer feeding areas and winter shelter locations. Inuit hunters developed sophisticated strategies for intercepting these migrations and harvesting animals efficiently while ensuring the continued health of the herds. The construction of caribou hunting weapons emphasized portability and accuracy rather than the massive strength required for marine mammal hunting. Bows were crafted from multiple pieces of wood, antler and sinew that were carefully shaped and joined to create flexible yet powerful weapons capable of driving arrows through thick caribou hide. The arrows themselves featured carefully balanced shafts tipped with sharp stone or metal points designed to cause rapid blood loss and quick death. Caribou hunting often involved the construction of elaborate drive systems that channeled migrating animals toward waiting hunters. These systems, known as tuk-tu drives, included stone cairns called anuksut that were arranged in converging lines stretching for several kilometers across the tundra. The cairns were topped with pieces of sod or other materials that would flutter in the wind, creating the impression of human figures that would cause the caribou to avoid certain routes and follow predetermined paths. The organization of caribou drives required extensive cooperation between multiple family groups and careful timing to coincide with migration patterns. Scouts would monitor herd movements and signal when animals were approaching the drive system, while hunters took positions at strategic bottlenecks where they could harvest animals efficiently. Women participated by maintaining the cairns and helping to process the large quantities of meat that successful drives could produce. Polar bear hunting represented perhaps the most prestigious and dangerous form of terrestrial hunting, requiring exceptional skill, courage and specialized knowledge of these formidable predators. Adult polar bears could weigh over 600 kilograms and possess tremendous strength, speed and intelligence that made them extremely dangerous adversaries. The hunting of these animals was typically undertaken by the most experienced hunters and was surrounded by elaborate spiritual protocols and taboos. The tracking of polar bears required intimate knowledge of ice conditions, weather patterns, and bear behavior that could only be acquired through years of experience. Hunters learned to read subtle signs including track patterns, feeding sites and denning locations that indicated bear presence and movement patterns. The approach to a polar bear required extreme caution, as these animals possessed keen senses of smell and hearing that could detect human presence from considerable distances. Polar bear hunting weapons needed to combine portability with stopping power, sufficient to bring down these massive predators quickly and safely. Spears with heavy stone or metal points were preferred over arrows as they provided better penetration and more reliable killing power. Some hunters used specialized bear spears with cross pieces behind the point that prevented a wounded bear from charging up the shaft to attack the hunter. The spiritual aspects of polar bear hunting were particularly elaborate, reflecting the special status of these animals in Inuit cosmology. Polar bears were believed to possess powerful spirits that demanded respectful treatment and proper ritual observances. Successful bear hunters were required to observe specific taboos and perform prescribed ceremonies that honored the bear's spirit and ensured continued hunting success. Musk ox hunting targeted the shaggy bovids that inhabited the northernmost regions of the Inuit territory, particularly in areas like northern Greenland and the high Arctic islands. These animals lived in small herds that used defensive formations to protect themselves from wolf attacks, creating opportunities for hunters who understood their behavioral patterns and could exploit their defensive strategies. The approach to musk ox herds required careful planning and coordination, as these animals would form defensive circles with adults facing outward, and young animals protected in the center when threatened. Hunters typically worked in pairs or small groups, using the terrain to approach within range while avoiding detection. The key to successful musk ox hunting was separating individual animals from the protective herd formation, making them vulnerable to spear or arrow attacks. Musk ox hunting weapons were similar to those used for caribou, but needed to be capable of penetrating the thick, matted hair that provided these animals with protection from both cold and predators. Spear points required exceptional sharpness and strength to penetrate effectively, while arrows needed heavy points and powerful bows to achieve adequate penetration for clean kills. The kayak represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of Arctic technology, combining elegant design with practical functionality in a watercraft perfectly adapted to Arctic marine conditions. These single-person boats were constructed using wooden frames covered with carefully prepared sealskins that created completely waterproof hulls capable of handling rough seas and ice-filled waters. The design of kayaks varied between different regions and reflected local conditions, hunting practices, and available materials. The construction of a kayak required master craftsmanship and intimate knowledge of materials and their properties under Arctic conditions. The frame was built using carefully selected pieces of driftwood or imported timber that were shaped and joined using traditional techniques that created flexible yet strong structures. The wood was often steamed or heated to achieve the precise curves needed for optimal hydrodynamic performance. The skin covering of kayaks used specially prepared sealskins that were carefully sewn together using waterproof seams that would not leak even under extreme conditions. The preparation of these skins required extensive knowledge of tanning and curing techniques that produced materials with the right combination of strength, flexibility, and water resistance. The sewing process used sinew thread and specialized stitching techniques that created seams stronger than the surrounding material. Kayak design incorporated sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamic principles that produced boats with excellent speed, maneuverability, and seaworthiness despite their light construction. The hull shapes were carefully refined to minimize drag while providing adequate stability for hunting activities. The cockpit openings were sized to allow the paddler to wear a spray skirt that created a watertight seal between the boat and the occupant, preventing water entry even in rough conditions. The paddle used with kayaks represented another example of refined Arctic technology, featuring carefully shaped blades and shafts that provided maximum efficiency with minimum effort. Traditional paddles were carved from single pieces of wood when possible, or constructed from multiple pieces joined with strong waterproof connections. The blade shapes varied according to local preferences and conditions, with some featuring narrow blades for speed and others using wider blades for power. Kayak hunting techniques required exceptional skill and coordination, as hunters had to manage their boats while handling weapons and dealing with wounded prey animals. The most challenging form of kayak hunting involved pursuing seals in open water, where the hunter had to approach close enough for a harpoon strike while maintaining boat control in potentially rough conditions. This required years of practice to develop the necessary paddling skills and hunting reflexes. The umiak, or women's boat, served as the primary means of transportation for families and large loads across Arctic waters. These open boats were much larger than kayaks, typically measuring 8 to 12 meters in length, and capable of carrying entire families with their possessions, dogs, and equipment. The construction of umiaks used similar principles to kayaks, but on a much larger scale, requiring substantial amounts of materials and extensive labor to complete. Umiak frames were built using heavy timbers that could support the weight of multiple passengers and cargo, while maintaining structural integrity in rough seas. The construction process required careful attention to load distribution and structural reinforcement at critical stress points. The frame members were joined using traditional techniques that created strong, flexible connections capable of withstanding the stresses of heavy loading and rough water conditions. The covering of umiaks typically used walrus hide or bearded seal skins that provided the strength and durability needed for heavy-duty marine transportation. These large skins had to be carefully prepared and sewn together using techniques that created waterproof seams capable of withstanding constant flexing and stress. The maintenance of umiak covers required regular attention as small leaks could quickly become serious problems when carrying heavy loads or traveling long distances. Snow knives represented essential tools for Arctic survival, used for cutting snow blocks for shelter construction, creating hunting blinds and modifying ice surfaces for various purposes. These specialized implements were typically made from bone, antler, or metal and featured long, thin blades designed for efficient cutting through different types of snow and ice. The design and construction of snow knives reflected deep understanding of snow properties and the requirements of different construction tasks. The blade shape of snow knives varied according to their intended use and the preferences of individual craftsmen. Some featured straight blades for general cutting tasks, while others incorporated curved profiles that facilitated the cutting of blocks with specific shapes and angles. The blade edges required regular maintenance to remain sharp enough for efficient cutting, particularly when working with hard, wind-packed snow that could quickly dull inferior tools. The handles of snow knives were designed for comfortable grip and efficient force transmission during extended use. Traditional handles were typically made from wood, bone, or antler and were shaped to fit the user's hand while providing secure grip even when wearing thick mittens. Some handles incorporated decorative elements that identified the owner or reflected personal artistic preferences. The construction of snow houses using snow knives required extensive knowledge of snow properties and sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles. Builders had to select appropriate snow conditions, cut blocks of the right size and shape, and arrange them in spiraling courses that created strong, stable domes. The cutting and placement of each block required precise technique to ensure proper fit and structural integrity. Arctic clothing systems represented perhaps the most critical survival technology, providing protection from extreme cold wind and moisture that could kill unprotected humans within minutes. Traditional Inuit clothing incorporated sophisticated understanding of insulation principles, moisture management and human physiology that produced garment systems capable of maintaining comfortable body temperature in conditions reaching -50°C or colder. The layering system used in traditional Arctic clothing typically included three main components: an inner layer of soft warm materials worn next to the skin, a middle layer providing primary insulation and an outer layer designed to block wind and shed moisture. Each layer served specific functions while working together to create an integrated system that could be adjusted according to activity levels and environmental conditions. Inner garments were typically made from soft warm materials like bird skins or fine caribou fur that provided insulation while allowing moisture vapor to pass through to outer layers. These garments were cut and sewn to fit closely to the body while allowing freedom of movement for hunting and other activities. The construction techniques used specialized seaming methods that eliminated bulk while maintaining insulation properties. The middle insulation layer typically consisted of caribou or seal fur garments that provided the primary thermal protection for the wearer. These garments featured thick, dense fur that trapped warm air while maintaining loft even in extreme conditions. The cut and design of these garments incorporated features like adjustable openings, ventilation systems, and specialized pocket arrangements that enhanced their functionality. Outer garments were designed to block wind and shed moisture while allowing vapor transfer from inner layers. These shells were typically made from tightly woven materials or specially prepared skins that provided weather protection without creating condensation problems inside the clothing system. The design incorporated features like storm flaps, adjustable closures and reinforced wear areas that enhanced durability and weather resistance. The sophisticated technological mastery and complex social structures that had enabled Inuit peoples to thrive across the Arctic for over a millennium would soon encounter an entirely different set of challenges as European explorers, traders, and settlers began penetrating Arctic waters and coastlines. These initial contacts, beginning with Norse expeditions around 1000 CE, marked the start of a gradual but irreversible transformation of traditional Inuit life that would accelerate dramatically over the following centuries. The earliest documented encounters between Inuit peoples and Europeans occurred in Greenland, where Norse settlers established two major colonies along the southwestern coast during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Eric the Red's colonization of Greenland around 985 CE brought approximately 400 to 500 Norse settlers to an island that had been inhabited by Dorset peoples for over a millennium, though the Dorset population had declined significantly by the time of Norse arrival. Archaeological evidence from sites like Brattlehead and Garda reveals that these early Norse settlements were substantial undertakings, featuring stone and turf longhouses, churches and livestock enclosures that supported a pastoral economy based on cattle, sheep and goats. The Thule expansion into Greenland around 1200 CE created the first sustained contact between Inuit ancestors and European settlers. Unlike the earlier Dorset peoples, who appear to have minimal interaction with the Norse, the Thule groups possessed superior hunting technologies and more aggressive territorial expansion patterns that brought them into direct competition with Norse settlements for marine resources and coastal territories. Archaeological evidence from sites in western Greenland shows clear evidence of interaction between these two cultures, including Norse artifacts found in Thule sites and Inuit materials recovered from Norse archaeological contexts. The nature of early Norse-Thule relationships was complex and varied considerably over time and geography. Written Norse sources, including the Groenlandinga saga and Eric's saga, describe encounters with people they called Skraelings, a term that encompassed both Inuit and Native American peoples encountered during various expeditions. These accounts described both hostile confrontations and trading relationships, suggesting that interactions between the two groups were situational rather than uniformly antagonistic. Norse trading relationships with Thule groups involved the exchange of European manufactured goods, particularly iron tools and weapons, for Arctic products that were valuable in European markets. Walrus ivory was especially prized in medieval Europe for carving religious artifacts and decorative objects, while narwhal tusks were sold as unicorn horns, commanding extraordinary prices among European nobility. Polar bear hides and live polar bears were also highly valued, with these massive Arctic predators serving as prestigious gifts between European rulers. The iron tools and weapons obtained through trade with Norse settlers represented significant technological advantages for Thule communities. Iron knife blades, spear points and harpoon heads were far superior to traditional stone and bone implements in terms of sharpness, durability and ease of maintenance. Archaeological evidence from Thule sites across Greenland and the eastern Canadian Arctic shows widespread distribution of Norse iron artifacts, indicating extensive trade networks that carried European materials far beyond the immediate contact zones. The introduction of European diseases during these early contact periods had devastating effects on Inuit populations who lacked immunity to Old World pathogens. Smallpox, measles and influenza epidemics swept through Arctic communities, causing mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 50% of affected populations. These disease outbreaks disrupted traditional hunting cycles, broke down social structures and created demographic imbalances that affected community survival for generations. The decline and eventual abandonment of Norse settlements in Greenland during the 14th and 15th centuries coincided with climatic cooling during the Little Ice Age and increased conflict with expanding Thule populations. Archaeological evidence from the western settlement, which was abandoned around 1350 CE, shows signs of increasing isolation from Europe and growing dependence on marine resources similar to those exploited by Inuit hunters. The final collapse of the eastern settlement around 1450 CE ended nearly 5 centuries of European presence in Greenland, leaving Inuit peoples as the sole human inhabitants of the island. The next significant phase of European contact began during the late 16th century, with English expeditions searching for the Northwest Passage, a hypothetical Arctic sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Martin Frobisher's 3 voyages between 1576 and 1578 marked the beginning of systematic English exploration of Arctic waters, and the first documented encounters between Inuit peoples and post-medieval Europeans. These expeditions were motivated by England's desire to find an alternative route to Asian markets that would bypass Spanish and Portuguese-controlled sea lanes. Frobisher's first voyage in 1576 brought him to what is now known as Frobisher Bay on Baffin Island, where his crew encountered Inuit hunters who initially appeared friendly and willing to engage in trade. The English explorers were impressed by Inuit kayaking skills and hunting technologies, with crew members describing the waterproof skin boats and sophisticated hunting weapons in detailed accounts that were among the first European descriptions of traditional Inuit technology. The initial peaceful contact between Frobisher's expedition and local Inuit groups quickly deteriorated into conflict and mutual distrust. When 5 English sailors disappeared after going ashore to establish trading contact, Frobisher assumed they had been captured or killed by the Inuit. In retaliation, he captured an Inuit hunter by using a ship's bell as bait, forcing the man to paddle his kayak within reach of the English vessel. This captive, along with his kayak and hunting equipment, was transported to England where he became a sensation at the court of Queen Elizabeth I, before dying shortly after arrival, probably from disease. Frobisher's second voyage in 1577 involved a larger expedition of 3 ships carrying 120 men, including miners and assayers who were tasked with evaluating the commercial potential of what Frobisher believed to be gold or discovered during his first voyage. The expedition established a temporary mining camp on Codlunarn Island, where they extracted approximately 200 tons of black rock that they believed contained precious metals. The presence of this larger English force created additional tensions with local Inuit populations, leading to several violent confrontations. The conflicts during Frobisher's second expedition included a pitched battle between English sailors and Inuit warriors that resulted in casualties on both sides. English accounts describe Inuit fighters using bows and arrows with remarkable accuracy, while the Inuit demonstrated tactical sophistication by using terrain features and weather conditions to their advantage. The English superiority in armor and firearms was offset by Inuit knowledge of local conditions and superior mobility across ice and snow. Frobisher's third and largest expedition in 1578 involved a fleet of 15 ships carrying over 400 men, including colonists intended to establish a permanent English settlement in the Arctic. This massive undertaking was motivated by continued belief in the value of the supposed gold ore and the strategic importance of controlling a Northwest Passage route. However, the expedition encountered severe ice conditions that prevented them from reaching their intended destination, forcing them to abandon colonization plans and focus on additional mining operations. The mining activities conducted during Frobisher's 3 voyages ultimately proved to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the geological samples they had collected. The black rock that had generated such excitement among English investors and court officials turned out to be worthless iron pyrite rather than gold-bearing ore. The failure of these mining ventures ended English interest in Arctic colonization for several decades, and left local Inuit populations with their first direct experience of European technological capabilities and territorial ambitions. The whaling industry that developed in Arctic waters during the 17th century created the next major phase of sustained contact between Inuit peoples and Europeans. Dutch, English and later American whaling vessels began operating in Davis Strait, Baffin Bay and other Arctic waters in pursuit of bowhead whales, which provided valuable oil for lighting and lubrication, as well as baleen for various manufactured products. These commercial whaling operations brought hundreds of European sailors into Arctic waters annually and established the first regular trade relationships between Inuit communities and European merchants. The Spitsbergen whale fishery, established by Dutch whalers around 1610, demonstrated the enormous profits available from Arctic whaling operations. Bowhead whales could yield up to 20 tons of oil and 1,500 kilograms of baleen, making successful whaling voyages extremely lucrative despite the high costs and risks involved. The success of Spitsbergen operations encouraged expansion into other Arctic regions, including the waters around Greenland and the eastern Canadian Arctic, where Inuit communities had been hunting whales for centuries. European whaling operations in Inuit territories created complex relationships that combined competition for whale resources with mutually beneficial trade arrangements. Inuit hunters possessed superior knowledge of local whale populations, ice conditions, and weather patterns that could mean the difference between successful and disastrous whaling seasons for European crews. At the same time, European vessels carried manufactured goods, weapons, and other materials that were highly valued by Inuit communities. The establishment of regular trading relationships between whaling crews and Inuit communities introduced a wide range of European manufactured goods into traditional Arctic economies. Iron tools and weapons, including knives, harpoon points, and firearms, provided significant advantages in hunting and warfare. Wooden materials, which were scarce in most Arctic regions, allowed for improvements in boat construction, shelter building, and tool manufacture. Textiles, beads, and other decorative items became incorporated into traditional clothing and expressions. The seasonal nature of whaling operations created patterns of contact that fit relatively well with traditional Inuit seasonal cycles. European whaling vessels typically arrived in Arctic waters during late spring and summer months when ice conditions permitted navigation, coinciding with periods when Inuit communities were engaged in intensive hunting activities. This timing allowed for extended interaction periods without completely disrupting traditional subsistence cycles. However, the intensive hunting pressure created by European whaling operations began to have noticeable effects on whale populations that Inuit communities depended upon for subsistence. Bowhead whales, which reproduced slowly and lived in relatively small populations, were particularly vulnerable to overhunting. The reduction in whale availability forced some Inuit communities to modify their hunting strategies and rely more heavily on smaller marine mammals and terrestrial resources. The introduction of firearms through whaling trade relationships created significant changes in Inuit hunting technologies and social relationships. Muskets and later rifles provided advantages in hunting large terrestrial mammals like caribou and musk oxen, but they also required ongoing supplies of gunpowder, shot and replacement parts that could only be obtained through continued trade with Europeans. This technological dependence created new forms of economic relationship that gradually altered traditional patterns of resource distribution and social organization. European alcohol, introduced through whaling trade, had particularly devastating effects on many Inuit communities. Traditional Inuit societies had no experience with fermented beverages and lacked cultural mechanisms for regulating alcohol consumption. The introduction of rum, whiskey, and other spirits led to widespread alcoholism that disrupted hunting activities, family relationships, and community decision-making processes. The social problems created by alcohol abuse would remain a persistent challenge for Inuit communities throughout the historical period. The first systematic missionary activities among Inuit peoples began during the early 18th century with the arrival of Moravian missionaries in Greenland and Labrador. These German Protestant missionaries were motivated by evangelical fervor to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, but they also brought medical knowledge, educational programs, and new forms of economic organization that had profound effects on traditional Inuit societies. Hans Egede, a Norwegian-Danish missionary, established the first permanent European mission among Inuit peoples when he founded Godtab in western Greenland in 1721. Egede's mission was supported by the Danish crown as part of broad efforts to reassert Danish sovereignty over Greenland and develop commercial relationships with Inuit populations. The mission served multiple functions, combining religious instruction with trade activities, medical services, and political administration. The Moravian missions established in Labrador beginning in 1771 created more intensive programs of cultural transformation than had been attempted in earlier contact situations. Missionaries like Jens Haven and Christian Larsen learned Inuktitut languages and developed written systems for recording traditional oral literature, while simultaneously working to replace traditional spiritual beliefs with Christian doctrines. These missions established permanent settlements where Inuit families were encouraged to abandon nomadic hunting lifestyles in favor of sedentary communities centered around church and school activities. The introduction of Christianity created complex processes of religious syncretism where traditional Inuit spiritual beliefs were modified and combined with Christian teachings rather than simply replaced. Many Inuit communities developed hybrid religious systems that incorporated Christian symbolism and ritual practices while maintaining traditional relationships with animal spirits and shamanic healing practices. This religious blending reflected the practical difficulties of completely abandoning spiritual systems that were closely integrated with subsistence activities and environmental knowledge. Missionary educational programs introduced literacy and European-style schooling to Inuit communities for the first time. The development of syllabic writing systems for Inuktitut languages allowed traditional oral literature to be recorded and preserved, but it also created new forms of cultural authority based on literacy skills rather than traditional knowledge and experience. Children who learned to read and write in mission schools often found themselves caught between traditional and European cultural systems, creating generational conflicts that affected family and community relationships. The medical services provided by missionary physicians and trained assistants offered significant benefits to Inuit communities that had limited treatments for certain types of injuries and diseases. European medical knowledge was particularly effective in treating wounds, setting broken bones, and performing surgical procedures that were beyond the capabilities of traditional healing practices. However, European medicine was less effective in addressing the epidemic diseases that continued to devastate Inuit populations throughout the contact period. The economic changes introduced through missionary activities included new forms of wage labor, commercial fishing and hunting, and craft production for European markets. Missions often operated trading posts that purchased furs, ivory, and other Arctic products while selling European manufactured goods, creating more systematic commercial relationships than had existed during the earlier period of sporadic contact with whaling crews and explorers. The gradual establishment of colonial administrative systems in Arctic regions during the 18th and 19th centuries created new forms of political relationship between Inuit communities and European governments. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, gradually extended its trading operations into Arctic regions, establishing posts that became focal points for commercial and political relationships between Inuit hunters and European colonial authorities. The fur trade relationships that developed through Hudson's Bay Company operations created economic dependencies that altered traditional Inuit subsistence patterns and social organizations. The company's focus on acquiring fox, seal, and other fur-bearing animal pelts encouraged Inuit hunters to spend more time on commercial hunting activities and less time on subsistence hunting for community consumption. This shift towards market-oriented hunting created new forms of economic inequality within Inuit communities and increased dependence on European trade goods for basic survival needs. The establishment of permanent trading posts also created new settlement patterns as Inuit families began spending longer periods near these commercial centers rather than following traditional seasonal migration routes. These proto-urban concentrations facilitated the spread of epidemic diseases and created sanitation problems that traditional nomadic lifestyles had avoided. The social problems associated with permanent settlements would become increasingly severe as colonial administrative systems expanded their control over Inuit territories. The introduction of European legal systems and concepts of territorial sovereignty created fundamental conflicts with traditional Inuit understandings of land use and resource rights. European colonial governments claimed exclusive jurisdiction over vast Arctic territories based on discovery rights and international treaties that had been negotiated without any input from indigenous inhabitants. These territorial claims conflicted with traditional Inuit concepts of hunting territories and seasonal resource access that had been developed over centuries of sustainable resource management. The cumulative effects of nearly 3 centuries of intermittent European contact had created significant changes in Inuit societies by the late 18th century, though many communities retained substantial elements of traditional culture and technology. The introduction of European diseases had caused severe population declines that disrupted traditional social structures and knowledge transmission systems. The availability of European trade goods had created new forms of economic relationship and technological dependence that altered traditional patterns of resource sharing and community organization. Despite these changes, most Inuit communities maintained their fundamental orientation towards marine and terrestrial hunting as the basis of subsistence and cultural identity. Traditional hunting technologies continue to be used alongside European tools and weapons, and traditional knowledge about ice conditions, weather patterns, and animal behavior remained essential for survival in Arctic environments. The complex processes of cultural adaptation and resistance that characterized this early contact period would continue to shape Inuit responses to accelerating European colonial expansion in the centuries that followed. The complex processes of cultural adaptation and resistance that had characterized early European contact would be fundamentally transformed during the 19th and early 20th centuries as colonial governments and commercial enterprises established systematic control over Arctic territories and indigenous inhabitants. The establishment of permanent trading posts, government administrative centers and missionary settlements created new forms of economic dependence and political subordination that would reshape every aspect of traditional Inuit life. This period witnessed the deliberate dismantling of nomadic hunting societies and their replacement with sedentary communities under direct European supervision. The Hudson's Bay Company's expansion into Arctic regions during the early 1800s marked the beginning of systematic commercial exploitation of Inuit territories and resources. Unlike the sporadic contact of earlier whaling and exploration expeditions, the company established permanent trading posts at strategic locations throughout the Arctic archipelago, creating year-round European presence in regions that had previously experienced only seasonal contact. These posts, constructed with imported lumber and equipped with European-manufactured goods, represented visible symbols of colonial authority and economic control. The construction of trading posts followed standardized company designs that reflected both practical necessities and symbolic assertions of European dominance. The typical post consisted of a main trading room where transactions were conducted, storage warehouses for trade goods and purchased furs, living quarters for the post manager and his assistants, and workshops for equipment maintenance and repair. These buildings were surrounded by wooden palisades that provided protection from harsh weather and potential conflicts while creating clear boundaries between European and indigenous spaces. The post managers who supervised these remote outposts wielded enormous influence over local Inuit communities through their control of trade goods and credit systems. These men, typically of Scottish or English background, served as intermediaries between Inuit hunters and distant corporate headquarters in London or Montreal. Their decisions about credit terms, trade values, and acceptable fur qualities directly affected the economic survival of entire communities. Many post managers learned basic Inuktitut vocabulary necessary for conducting trade, but few developed deeper understanding of traditional Inuit culture or social organization. The credit system introduced by trading companies created new forms of economic dependence that fundamentally altered traditional Inuit subsistence patterns. Hunters were encouraged to take goods on credit at the beginning of each trapping season, with the understanding that they would repay these debts through fur deliveries at the end of the season. This system encouraged intensive trapping of commercially valuable species like Arctic fox, while reducing time and effort devoted to traditional subsistence hunting for seals, caribou and other food animals. The focus on commercial trapping created significant ecological pressures on fur-bearing animal populations that had not experienced intensive hunting pressure under traditional Inuit harvesting systems. Arctic fox populations in particular experienced dramatic fluctuations as European demand for white fox pelts encouraged overharvesting during peak price periods. These population crashes had cascading effects on Arctic ecosystems and reduced the long-term sustainability of commercial trapping operations. The introduction of European trade goods through company posts created technological dependencies that gradually undermined traditional Inuit manufacturing skills and resource independence. Metal tools, firearms, ammunition, flour, sugar, tea, and tobacco became essential components of daily life for many Inuit families, requiring continued participation in the commercial economy to maintain access to these materials. The superior performance of steel knives, metal cooking pots and woven textiles made them highly desirable, but their availability depended entirely on successful commercial hunting and continued company operations. The establishment of permanent settlements around trading posts disrupted traditional seasonal migration patterns that had been essential components of sustainable Arctic subsistence systems. Inuit families who had previously moved between different hunting and fishing locations according to seasonal resource availability found themselves increasingly tied to permanent settlements where trading posts, missions, and government services were located. This sedentarization process concentrated populations in locations that were chosen for European administrative convenience rather than optimal resource access. Government policies promoting sedentarization became more systematic and coercive during the 19th and early 20th centuries, as colonial administrators sought to establish direct control over indigenous populations. Canadian government officials viewed nomadic hunting lifestyles as primitive and economically inefficient, requiring transformation into sedentary agricultural or wage labor communities that would be easier to govern and tax. These policies reflected broader colonial ideologies that equated European settlement patterns with civilization and progress. The construction of permanent housing in government-sponsored settlements followed European architectural models that were poorly adapted to Arctic environmental conditions and traditional Inuit family structures. Frame houses with conventional heating systems required constant supplies of imported fuel and materials that were expensive to transport and maintain in remote Arctic locations. These structures often suffered from condensation problems, inadequate insulation and ventilation systems that created unhealthy living conditions compared to traditional snow houses and skin tents. The concentration of previously dispersed populations in permanent settlements created serious sanitation and health problems that had not existed under traditional nomadic lifestyles. Waste disposal, water supply, and sewage management became critical issues when dozens of families were living in close proximity throughout the year. Traditional methods of waste disposal that worked effectively for small, mobile camps became inadequate for permanent settlements, leading to contamination of local water sources and increased transmission of infectious diseases. The establishment of formal education systems represented one of the most systematic attempts to transform traditional Inuit culture and social organization. Government and missionary schools were designed to replace indigenous knowledge systems with European curricula that emphasized literacy, numeracy, and vocational skills deemed appropriate for integration into colonial economic systems. These educational programs were conducted primarily in English or French, with Inuktitut languages actively discouraged or prohibited in classroom settings. The residential school system that was implemented in many Arctic regions involved the forced removal of Inuit children from their families and communities for extended periods of education in distant institutions. These schools, operated by various Christian denominations under government contracts, aimed to eliminate indigenous cultural practices and replace them with European values and behaviors. Children were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice traditional customs or maintain contact with traditional spiritual beliefs and practices. The daily routine in residential schools was designed to instill European concepts of time management, individual achievement and hierarchical authority that conflicted with traditional Inuit values of collective decision-making and consensus building. Students were required to follow rigid schedules that divided the day into discrete periods for academic instruction, vocational training, meals and supervised recreation. This regimentation was intended to prepare students for integration into wage labor economies, where punctuality and individual productivity were highly valued. The curriculum in government and missionary schools emphasized basic literacy and numeracy skills, along with vocational training that prepared students for roles as interpreters, clerks or skilled laborers in the colonial economy. Academic subjects included reading, writing, arithmetic, geography and history that presented European perspectives on world events and cultural development. Vocational training focused on skills like carpentry, mechanics, and domestic work that were considered appropriate for indigenous peoples within the colonial social hierarchy. The suppression of Inuktitut languages in educational settings had devastating effects on traditional knowledge transmission systems that depended on oral instruction and storytelling. Children who spent years in residential schools often returned to their communities with limited ability to communicate effectively in their native languages and reduced understanding of traditional hunting techniques, spiritual practices, and social protocols. This linguistic disruption created generational gaps that weakened community cohesion and cultural continuity. The introduction of European medical systems and healthcare services brought significant benefits in treating certain types of injuries and illnesses, but it also disrupted traditional healing practices and created new forms of dependence on outside medical authority. Government-sponsored nursing stations and visiting physicians provided access to surgical procedures, pharmaceuticals, and diagnostic techniques that were beyond the capabilities of traditional Inuit healers. However, these medical services were often unavailable during critical periods and showed limited understanding of traditional healing knowledge that had proven effective for centuries. The devastating impact of introduced diseases continued to be the most serious health challenge facing Inuit communities throughout the colonial period. Tuberculosis emerged as a particularly severe problem, spreading rapidly through overcrowded settlements and causing mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 25% of affected communities. The bacterial infection thrived in the poor ventilation and close living conditions that characterized many government-sponsored settlements, creating epidemic conditions that overwhelmed available medical resources. Tuberculosis epidemics had particularly severe effects on Inuit communities because the disease often affected adults in their prime productive years, disrupting hunting activities and childcare responsibilities. The chronic nature of tuberculosis meant that affected individuals required long-term care that strained family resources and community support systems. Many tuberculosis patients were evacuated to distant sanatoriums in southern Canada for treatment, separating them from their families and communities for months or years at a time. Influenza outbreaks continued to cause periodic epidemics that devastated Inuit populations throughout the colonial period. The 1918 influenza pandemic was particularly severe in Arctic regions, where entire communities were affected simultaneously and lacked access to medical care or basic supplies needed to care for the sick. Some settlements lost more than half their population during this pandemic, creating demographic disruptions that affected community survival for decades afterward. Measles, whooping cough and other childhood diseases that were relatively mild in European populations, often proved fatal for Inuit children who lacked inherited immunity to these pathogens. These diseases spread rapidly through settlements where children lived in close contact with each other, particularly in residential school environments where students from different communities were housed together. The high mortality rates among children disrupted traditional patterns of cultural transmission and created long-term demographic imbalances in many communities. The medical evacuation programs that developed during the mid-20th century involved the transportation of seriously ill Inuit patients to hospitals in southern Canada for treatment that was unavailable in Arctic communities. These evacuations, while often life-saving, created additional trauma for patients who were separated from their families and placed in unfamiliar cultural environments where they could not communicate effectively with medical staff or understand the treatment procedures being performed. The introduction of European legal systems and concepts of individual property rights created fundamental conflicts with traditional Inuit concepts of collective resource management and territorial use. Colonial governments imposed legal frameworks that recognized individual ownership of land and resources while denying the validity of traditional hunting territories and seasonal resource access rights that had been maintained for centuries through customary law and community consensus. The establishment of game laws and hunting regulations represented direct challenges to traditional Inuit subsistence practices and resource management systems. Government wildlife managers, operating with limited understanding of Arctic ecosystems and traditional hunting practices, imposed restrictions on hunting seasons, bag limits, and approved hunting methods that often conflicted with traditional conservation practices and subsistence needs. These regulations were enforced by government agents who had little knowledge of local environmental conditions or traditional resource management systems. The licensing and registration requirements imposed on Inuit hunters created bureaucratic barriers to traditional subsistence activities while asserting government authority over indigenous resource rights. Hunters were required to obtain permits for activities that their ancestors had practiced for centuries, subjecting traditional subsistence practices to government approval and regulation. The administrative costs and procedures associated with these requirements created additional burdens for communities that were already struggling with economic and social disruption. The establishment of territorial boundaries and administrative jurisdictions divided traditional Inuit territories according to European concepts of political sovereignty that ignored indigenous territorial relationships and seasonal migration patterns. These artificial boundaries often separated communities from traditional hunting grounds and family relationships, creating administrative complications that affected everything from medical services to educational programs. The development of wage labor economies around government installations, trading posts, and resource extraction projects created new forms of economic relationship that gradually replaced traditional subsistence activities. Inuit men were employed as guides, interpreters, construction workers and general laborers for various government and commercial projects, receiving cash wages that could be used to purchase imported goods and services. These employment opportunities provided access to European consumer goods, but also created dependence on external economic systems that were subject to fluctuations beyond community control. The transformation of traditional gender roles accompanied the introduction of wage labor economies and permanent settlements. Men who had previously shared hunting and family responsibilities with their wives found themselves working for wages outside the community, while women assumed greater responsibility for household management and child care within settlement environments. These changes disrupted traditional patterns of cooperative labor and decision-making that had characterized traditional Inuit family structures. The introduction of formal political structures based on European models of representative democracy conflicted with traditional Inuit consensus-building processes and collective decision-making systems. Government-appointed administrators and elected councils operated according to majority rule principles that often ignored minority viewpoints and traditional protocols for resolving community disputes. These new political systems concentrated decision-making authority in formal positions, rather than recognizing the traditional influence of elders, successful hunters, and other community members who had earned respect through demonstrated competence and wisdom. The establishment of police detachments and formal law enforcement systems introduced European concepts of criminal justice that conflicted with traditional methods of conflict resolution and community healing. Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers stationed in Arctic communities were responsible for enforcing Canadian criminal law and government regulations, often without understanding the cultural contexts and traditional practices that influenced community behavior. The arrest and prosecution of community members for violations of government laws created tensions between Indigenous and European legal systems. The construction of communication systems, including radio stations, telegraph lines, and later telephone networks, connected remote Arctic communities to southern administrative centers and commercial markets for the first time. These communication technologies facilitated government administration and commercial operations, but also accelerated the pace of cultural change by exposing Inuit communities to outside influences and reducing their isolation from broader Canadian society. The development of transportation infrastructure, including airstrips, roads, and improved harbor facilities made Arctic communities more accessible to outside visitors and government services, while also facilitating the movement of people and goods that further integrated these communities into broader economic and social systems. The construction of these facilities often required substantial environmental modification that affected traditional hunting and fishing areas, creating additional disruptions to traditional subsistence activities. The cumulative effects of these colonial policies and institutional changes had fundamentally transformed traditional Inuit societies by the mid-20th century. The nomadic hunting communities that had sustained themselves in the Arctic for over a millennium had been largely replaced by sedentary settlements dependent on government services, commercial employment, and imported goods for their basic survival. Traditional knowledge systems, spiritual practices, and social institutions have been severely disrupted, though not entirely eliminated, by systematic programs of cultural transformation and assimilation. The systematic transformation of Inuit societies through colonial policies and institutional control reached its most intensive and destructive phase with the implementation of residential school systems across the Arctic during the mid-20th century. These institutions, designed explicitly to eliminate indigenous cultural practices and replace them with European values and behaviors, represented the culmination of decades of colonial efforts to assimilate indigenous peoples into mainstream Canadian society. The residential school system would inflict profound and lasting trauma on Inuit communities while deliberately severing the transmission of traditional knowledge, languages, and spiritual practices that had sustained Arctic peoples for over a millennium. The establishment of residential schools in Inuit territories followed patterns that had been developed in other parts of Canada, but the implementation in Arctic regions created unique challenges and intensified trauma due to the extreme geographical isolation and the fundamental incompatibility between institutional structures and traditional Inuit lifestyles. The first residential schools serving Inuit children opened during the 1950s, with major institutions established at Chesterfield Inlet in 1951, Igloolik in 1962, and several other strategic locations across the Arctic archipelago. These schools were operated by various Christian denominations, including the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and other Protestant organizations, all working under contracts with the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. The physical structures of these residential schools reflected European institutional architecture that was entirely foreign to Inuit cultural traditions and poorly adapted to Arctic environmental conditions. The buildings were typically large, multi-story structures constructed with imported materials and designed to house hundreds of children in dormitory-style accommodations. The Tukudal Hall Residential School at Chesterfield Inlet, operated by the Oblate missionaries, could accommodate over 200 students in dormitories that featured rows of identical beds arranged in military-style formations. The institutional design emphasized surveillance and control, with long corridors, communal washrooms, and dining halls that facilitated supervision while eliminating privacy and personal space. The recruitment of students for residential schools involved systematic campaigns by government agents, missionaries, and Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, who traveled to remote hunting camps and settlements to identify school-aged children. Parents were told that education was mandatory under Canadian law, and that children who did not attend residential schools would be denied government services, including healthcare, family allowances, and other benefits that had become essential for survival in the transformed Arctic economy. Many families were given misleading information about the duration and nature of educational programs, being told that their children would return home for holidays and summers, when in reality most students remained at the schools for years without family contact. The separation of children from their families typically occurred during late summer or early fall, when government vessels and aircraft could access remote communities before winter ice conditions made transportation impossible. These removal operations were often traumatic scenes, where young children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, were taken from their parents and loaded onto ships or planes for transportation to distant residential schools. Many children had never been inside large mechanical vehicles, and found the transportation itself terrifying, while the separation from their families created immediate psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The daily routine within residential schools was designed to eliminate all connections to traditional Inuit culture, and replace indigenous ways of life with European institutional behaviors. Students were awakened at dawn by electric bells, and required to dress in identical uniforms that replaced traditional clothing. The boys typically wore dark pants, white shirts and black shoes, while girls were dressed in plain dresses or skirts, with standard-issue undergarments, and shoes that were often poorly fitted and uncomfortable. These uniforms were intended to eliminate visual markers of indigenous identity, while creating institutional conformity that reflected European values of standardization and hierarchy. The prohibition of Inuktitut languages represented one of the most systematic and destructive aspects of the residential school program. Students were forbidden to speak their native languages at any time, with violations punished through various forms of physical and psychological abuse. Children caught speaking Inuktitut were subjected to beatings with leather straps, forced to stand in corners for hours, denied meals, or subjected to public humiliation in front of other students. Some schools implemented systems where students were encouraged to report language violations by their peers, creating atmospheres of surveillance and mistrust that undermined traditional values of community cooperation and mutual support. The enforcement of English-only policies was particularly traumatic for young children who arrived at residential schools with limited or no knowledge of European languages. These children found themselves unable to communicate their basic needs, fears, or physical discomfort to school staff, creating situations of profound isolation and helplessness. Many students described the experience of losing their native language as a form of spiritual death, as Inuktitut was not merely a communication tool, but the medium through which traditional knowledge, spiritual concepts, and cultural identity were expressed and maintained. The academic curriculum in residential schools emphasized basic literacy and numeracy skills, while systematically excluding any content related to traditional Inuit knowledge, history, or cultural practices. Students learned to read and write using textbooks that depicted European and Southern Canadian experiences while ignoring the Arctic environment and indigenous ways of life that had shaped their communities for centuries. Geography lessons focused on European countries and Southern Canadian provinces, while treating the Arctic as an empty wasteland rather than a complex ecosystem with its own history and cultural significance. Religious instruction formed a central component of the residential school curriculum, with students required to attend daily chapel services, memorize Christian prayers and hymns, and participate in religious ceremonies that explicitly condemned traditional Inuit spiritual practices as pagan superstitions. Students were taught that their ancestors' beliefs in animal spirits, shamanic healing, and traditional ceremonies were evil practices that would lead to eternal damnation. This religious indoctrination created profound spiritual confusion for children who had been raised with traditional beliefs, forcing them to choose between their ancestral heritage and their hope for salvation in the Christian worldview. The vocational training programs in residential schools were designed to prepare students for roles as manual laborers, domestic workers, and low-skilled employees in the colonial economy rather than providing education that would enable them to become community leaders or maintain traditional subsistence practices. Boys were taught carpentry, mechanics, and general construction skills that were intended to make them useful workers for government and commercial projects in the Arctic. Girls received instruction in cooking, cleaning, sewing, and childcare that prepared them for roles as domestic workers or wives in European-style households. The industrial work programs within residential schools exploited student labor to maintain the institutions while providing minimal compensation or educational value. Students were required to work several hours daily in school kitchens, laundries, workshops, and maintenance facilities, performing tasks that kept the institutions operating while generating profits for the religious organizations that managed them. This unpaid labor was justified as vocational training, but in reality it represented a form of institutional exploitation that treated indigenous children as free workers rather than students deserving quality education. The living conditions within residential schools were often harsh and unsanitary, with overcrowded dormitories, inadequate heating, poor ventilation, and limited access to clean water and proper sanitation facilities. Students slept in dormitories that housed dozens of children in close quarters, creating ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases including tuberculosis, influenza, and other respiratory ailments. The institutional diet typically consisted of poor quality food that lacked the nutritional content and cultural significance of traditional Inuit foods, leading to malnutrition and health problems that affected students' physical and mental development. The medical care provided in residential schools was often inadequate and sometimes deliberately neglectful, with sick children receiving minimal treatment while being expected to continue their academic and work responsibilities. Many schools lacked qualified medical staff and relied on untrained personnel to diagnose and treat serious illnesses. Students who became seriously ill were often isolated from other children but received little actual medical attention, leading to preventable deaths that devastated families and communities when the news eventually reached home. The psychological abuse inflicted in residential schools included systematic humiliation, emotional manipulation, and deliberate attempts to destroy students' sense of cultural identity and self-worth. Students were told repeatedly that their families were primitive, their traditions were backward, and their languages were inferior to European ways of life. This psychological assault was designed to create shame about indigenous identity while fostering dependence on European authority figures for validation and approval. Physical abuse was endemic in many residential schools, with students subjected to beatings, sexual assault, and other forms of violence that were either officially sanctioned as discipline or tacitly permitted by institutional authorities who viewed indigenous children as less deserving of protection than European children. The isolated locations of these schools and the lack of oversight from external authorities created environments where abusive staff members could act with impunity while students had no recourse for protection or justice. The sexual abuse that occurred in residential schools was particularly devastating, involving both staff members and older students who perpetuated cycles of violence within the institutional environment. Many students were subjected to repeated sexual assault over periods of years, creating trauma that would affect their ability to form healthy relationships and trust others throughout their lives. The religious contexts of these institutions made the abuse particularly confusing for students who were simultaneously being taught about Christian morality while experiencing violence from the very people who claimed to represent divine authority. The communication restrictions imposed by residential schools prevented students from maintaining meaningful contact with their families and communities, creating artificial separations that weaken traditional kinship bonds and support systems. Letters home were heavily censored, with any references to problems at the school or expressions of homesickness removed before the letters were sent. Many families received no communication from their children for months or years at a time, not knowing whether their children were alive, healthy, or receiving adequate care. The summer vacation policies varied between different schools and time periods, but many students were required to remain at residential schools year-round, preventing them from participating in traditional seasonal activities and maintaining connections to their home communities. Students who were allowed to return home for brief periods often found themselves alienated from their families and communities due to their changed language abilities, cultural knowledge, and social behaviors that had been modified by institutional programming. The long-term psychological effects of residential school experiences included depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and various forms of addictive behavior that affected survivors throughout their lives. Many former students struggled with alcoholism, drug abuse, and other destructive behaviors as they attempted to cope with the trauma they had experienced, while simultaneously trying to reconnect with cultural traditions they had been forced to abandon. The shame and confusion created by residential school experiences made it difficult for survivors to discuss their experiences even with family members and counselors who wanted to provide support. The intergenerational transmission of trauma became evident as residential school survivors became parents and found themselves unable to provide the nurturing and cultural guidance that their children needed. Many survivors had been separated from their families during critical developmental periods when they should have been learning parenting skills, traditional knowledge, and cultural values from their elders. The institutional environment had provided no models for healthy family relationships or traditional child-rearing practices, leaving many survivors without the knowledge and emotional resources needed to raise their own children effectively. The disruption of traditional knowledge transmission systems represented one of the most devastating long-term consequences of the residential school system. Children who should have been learning hunting techniques, environmental knowledge, spiritual practices, and cultural traditions from their elders instead spent their formative years in institutions that actively suppressed this knowledge. When these children returned to their communities as young adults, they often lacked the skills and knowledge needed to participate effectively in traditional subsistence activities or cultural practices. The loss of language fluency among residential school survivors created communication barriers that affected their relationships with elders and other community members who had not attended these institutions. Many survivors found themselves caught between two worlds, lacking full fluency in either English or Inuktitut, and unable to communicate effectively in either cultural context. This linguistic displacement contributed to feelings of cultural alienation and identity confusion that persisted throughout their lives. The impact on family structures was particularly severe as residential school experiences disrupted traditional patterns of extended family relationships and collective child rearing that had been essential components of Inuit social organization. Survivors often struggled to maintain connections with extended family members, and found it difficult to participate in traditional kinship obligations and support systems that required cultural knowledge and social skills they had been prevented from developing. The spiritual trauma inflicted by residential schools affected not only individual survivors, but entire communities, as traditional spiritual practices and beliefs were disrupted by the systematic indoctrination that had condemned indigenous spirituality as evil or primitive. Many communities lost access to traditional healing practices, ceremonial knowledge, and spiritual guidance that had been essential components of cultural identity and community cohesion for centuries. The economic consequences of residential school policies extended far beyond individual trauma to affect entire communities that lost access to traditional knowledge systems needed for sustainable resource management and economic self-sufficiency. Young adults who returned from residential schools often lacked the hunting, fishing, and survival skills needed to participate effectively in traditional subsistence activities, creating increased dependence on government services and wage employment that was often unavailable in remote Arctic communities. The political implications of residential school policies included the systematic removal of potential community leaders during their formative years, preventing them from developing the cultural knowledge, language skills, and community connections needed to provide effective leadership for their communities. This leadership vacuum contributed to the political marginalization of Inuit communities and reduced their ability to resist further colonial policies or advocate effectively for their rights and interests. The documentation and acknowledgement of residential school abuses began slowly during the 1980s and 1990s as survivors began speaking publicly about their experiences and demanding recognition of the trauma they had endured. The establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2008 provided a formal mechanism for documenting residential school experiences and their ongoing effects on Indigenous communities, though the process of healing and reconciliation continues to be complicated by the profound and lasting nature of the trauma that was inflicted. The profound trauma inflicted by residential schools and systematic cultural suppression would intersect with unprecedented global events during the 1940s that would transform the Arctic from a remote frontier into a strategic battleground of international significance. World War II brought massive military installations, thousands of personnel, and revolutionary technologies to Inuit territories, accelerating processes of modernization and cultural change that had been developing gradually over previous decades. The war's demands for Arctic weather data, strategic positioning, and continental defense would establish permanent military and civilian infrastructure that fundamentally altered traditional relationships between Inuit communities and the land they had inhabited for centuries. The strategic importance of Arctic regions became apparent to military planners as early as 1940, when the Battle of Britain demonstrated the crucial role that accurate weather forecasting played in modern warfare. Meteorological conditions over the Arctic significantly influenced weather patterns across North America and Europe, making Arctic weather stations essential for predicting conditions that could affect bombing raids, naval operations, and troop movements thousands of kilometers away. The vast expanses of the Arctic also offered potential routes for enemy aircraft or submarines attempting to attack North American targets, requiring surveillance systems that could detect and track hostile forces across previously unmonitored territories. The establishment of weather stations across the Arctic archipelago began in earnest during 1942, with joint Canadian-American operations setting up installations at remote locations including Resolute Bay, Eureka, and Alert. These stations required year-round staffing by meteorologists, radio operators, and support personnel who maintained sophisticated equipment for measuring temperature, wind speed, barometric pressure, and other atmospheric conditions that were transmitted hourly to military headquarters in Ottawa and Washington. The construction of these facilities involved massive logistical operations that brought construction equipment, building materials, fuel supplies, and personnel to locations that had previously been accessible only to Inuit hunters using traditional transportation methods. The weather station at Eureka, established on Ellesmere Island in 1947, exemplified the scale and complexity of these military installations. The facility included heated buildings for equipment and personnel, diesel generators providing continuous electrical power, radio transmission equipment capable of communicating with stations thousands of kilometers away, and landing strips suitable for aircraft delivering supplies and rotating personnel. The station required regular supply flights carrying fuel, food, replacement equipment, and other materials that sustained a permanent population of 15 to 20 personnel in one of the most isolated locations on Earth. The construction of these installations required extensive modification of Arctic landscapes that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Heavy machinery including bulldozers, graders, and excavators was transported to remote locations to level terrain, construct foundations, and build airstrips capable of handling large transport aircraft. The environmental impact of this construction included the removal of vegetation, alteration of drainage patterns, and disruption of wildlife habitat that affected traditional hunting grounds used by nearby Inuit communities. The presence of military personnel at these installations created the first sustained contact between many Inuit communities and large numbers of non-Indigenous people. The weather station crews, typically consisting of young men from southern Canada and the United States, brought with them different cultural values, social behaviors, and economic relationships that contrasted sharply with traditional Inuit ways of life. Many military personnel were curious about Indigenous culture, and eager to learn hunting techniques, language basics, and survival skills from local Inuit hunters, creating informal educational exchanges that benefited both groups. However, the military installations also introduced social problems that had not existed in traditional Inuit communities. The availability of alcohol among military personnel led to increased drinking problems in nearby Indigenous communities, as Inuit individuals gained access to substances that their traditional culture had no mechanisms for regulating. The concentration of young men with regular wages and access to manufactured goods created economic disparities and social tensions that disrupted traditional patterns of resource sharing and community cooperation. The employment opportunities created by military installations provided the first regular wage labor available to many Inuit men, who were hired as guides, interpreters, general laborers, and hunting specialists who provided fresh meat for station personnel. These jobs offered cash wages that could be used to purchase manufactured goods, but they also required men to spend extended periods away from their families and traditional hunting activities. The steady income from military employment created new forms of economic security, but also increased dependence on external economic systems that were subject to military priorities and budget allocations beyond community control. The technological innovations introduced through military installations included radio communication systems, motorized vehicles, and electrical power generation that demonstrated possibilities for modernizing traditional lifestyles. Inuit families living near weather stations gained access to radio broadcasts that connected them to news and entertainment from southern Canada and the United States for the first time. The availability of electrical power for lighting, heating, and operating equipment showed alternatives to traditional oil lamps and heating systems that had been used for centuries. The aircraft operations associated with weather stations and supply missions introduced Inuit communities to aviation technology that would revolutionize Arctic transportation within a few decades. The regular flights bringing supplies and personnel to remote installations demonstrated the potential for rapid travel across vast distances that had previously required weeks or months of overland travel. Many Inuit individuals received their first airplane rides as passengers on supply flights, experiencing perspectives on their traditional territories that had never been possible before. The Cold War tensions that developed between the United States and Soviet Union after 1945 transformed the Arctic from a wartime strategic asset into a permanent frontier of continental defense. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles and long-range bomber aircraft made the Arctic the most likely route for any nuclear attack on North America, requiring sophisticated radar systems and interceptor aircraft bases that could detect and destroy incoming threats. The Distant Early Warning Line, constructed between 1954 and 1957, represented the largest military construction project in Arctic history and would have profound effects on Inuit communities across northern Canada and Alaska. The DEW line consisted of 63 radar stations stretching from Alaska to Greenland, designed to detect Soviet aircraft or missiles crossing the Arctic Ocean toward North American targets. The construction of this massive defense system required unprecedented logistical operations that brought thousands of workers, millions of tons of equipment and supplies, and revolutionary construction techniques to the most remote regions of the Arctic. The project involved the coordination of military and civilian contractors from both Canada and the United States, creating the largest industrial undertaking ever attempted in Arctic regions. The environmental impact of DEW line construction was enormous, involving the modification of landscapes across thousands of kilometers of previously undisturbed Arctic terrain. The construction crews used heavy machinery to level sites for radar installations, built roads connecting different facilities, constructed airstrips capable of handling large cargo aircraft, and established fuel storage facilities containing millions of liters of diesel fuel and aviation gasoline. The scale of this construction dwarfed all previous development in the Arctic, and created permanent alterations to ecosystems that had remained stable for millennia. The effects on traditional Inuit hunting grounds were particularly severe, as radar installations were often located on elevated terrain that provided optimal coverage, but also served as important wildlife habitat and traditional hunting locations. The construction activities disrupted caribou migration routes that had been used for centuries, forcing herds to find alternative paths that often took them away from traditional hunting areas used by Inuit communities. The noise and activity associated with construction operations also affected marine mammal populations, particularly seals and whales that avoided areas with high levels of human activity. The employment opportunities created by DEW line construction provided temporary but well-paying jobs for hundreds of Inuit men who worked as laborers, equipment operators, and guides for construction crews working in unfamiliar Arctic conditions. The wages offered for this work were substantially higher than anything previously available in Arctic communities, providing access to cash incomes that enabled families to purchase snowmobiles, rifles and other manufactured goods that would transform traditional lifestyles. However, the temporary nature of construction employment created boom-and-bust cycles that left many communities economically dependent on projects that ended abruptly when construction was completed. The permanent operation of DEW line facilities required smaller numbers of personnel than the construction phase, but created ongoing employment opportunities for Inuit individuals who could serve as maintenance workers, security guards, and general laborers at radar installations. These jobs provided steady incomes, but required workers to adopt schedules and work patterns that conflicted with traditional seasonal hunting and fishing activities. Many Inuit employees found themselves unable to participate in traditional subsistence activities during critical periods when their presence was required at military installations. The introduction of snowmobiles during the late 1950s and early 1960s represented one of the most significant technological changes in traditional Inuit transportation systems since the adoption of dog sleds centuries earlier. The first snowmobiles were primitive machines with limited reliability and range, but they offered advantages in speed and cargo capacity that made them attractive alternatives to dog teams for certain types of travel. The Bombardier Company began marketing snowmobiles specifically for Arctic use during the early 1960s, creating machines that could operate reliably in extreme cold conditions and handle the rough terrain typical of Arctic travel. The adoption of snowmobiles created fundamental changes in traditional relationships between Inuit hunters and their environment. Dog teams had required extensive knowledge of animal care, breeding and training that connected hunters to biological systems and seasonal cycles that governed Arctic life. Snowmobiles eliminated these biological connections while creating new dependencies on mechanical systems, fuel supplies, and replacement parts that were only available through commercial suppliers located in distant urban centers. The speed advantages offered by snowmobiles enabled hunters to travel much greater distances in shorter periods, expanding the range of hunting territories that could be accessed during single trips. This increased mobility allowed hunters to pursue caribou herds, locate seal breathing holes and access fishing locations that had previously been too distant for practical exploitation using dog teams. However, the mechanical reliability problems that plagued early snowmobiles also created new risks, as hunters who experienced breakdowns far from home lacked the backup transportation that dog teams had traditionally provided. The fuel requirements of snowmobiles created new economic dependencies that affected traditional subsistence patterns and community economics. Gasoline and oil had to be purchased with cash, requiring hunters to engage in wage labor or commercial hunting activities that generated income for equipment operation. The ongoing costs of fuel, maintenance, and repairs made snowmobile ownership expensive compared to dog teams that could be sustained using traditional hunting and fishing activities without cash expenditures. The social implications of snowmobile adoption included changes in hunting group composition and traditional patterns of knowledge transmission between generations. Snowmobiles could be operated by individuals without the extensive training and experience required for managing dog teams, reducing the importance of traditional knowledge and skills that had been passed down through generations of hunters. Young hunters could achieve mobility and hunting success without learning traditional animal husbandry techniques, weather prediction skills and other forms of environmental knowledge that had been essential components of Arctic survival. The introduction of modern rifles during this period complemented the mobility advantages offered by snowmobiles while creating additional dependencies on external supply systems. High-powered rifles with telescopic sights provided significant advantages in hunting large game animals like caribou and polar bears, offering greater accuracy and killing power than traditional weapons. However, these firearms required regular supplies of ammunition, replacement parts, and maintenance services that were only available through commercial suppliers, creating ongoing costs that had to be met through cash income or credit arrangements. The combination of snowmobiles and modern firearms enabled individual hunters to achieve levels of hunting success that had previously required coordinated group efforts, reducing the importance of traditional cooperative hunting strategies and social relationships that had bound communities together for centuries. Successful hunters with access to modern equipment could harvest game animals more efficiently than ever before, but this increased individual capability came at the cost of reduced community cooperation and shared decision-making about resource management and distribution. The communication revolution that accompanied technological modernization included the introduction of radio systems that connected remote communities to outside world for the first time. Two-way radio networks established by government agencies and commercial operators enabled communities to communicate with medical facilities, government offices and supply sources in southern Canada, reducing the isolation that had characterized Arctic life for centuries. These communication systems provided access to emergency medical advice, weather information and coordination of supply deliveries that improved safety and convenience for community residents. However, radio communication also accelerated the pace of cultural change by exposing Inuit communities to outside influences, including news broadcasts, popular music and advertising for consumer products that created new desires and expectations among community members. The availability of radio entertainment reduced the importance of traditional storytelling and community gatherings that had served as primary sources of information and social interaction during long winter months. The economic transitions that accompanied technological modernization represented fundamental shifts from subsistence economies toward market-oriented systems that required cash income for basic survival needs. Traditional hunting and fishing activities that had provided food, clothing and shelter materials for centuries became supplemented and sometimes replaced by wage labor, government assistance programs and commercial hunting activities that generated income for purchasing manufactured goods and services. The introduction of government family allowance payments during the 1940s provided the first regular cash income for many Inuit families, creating new forms of economic security while also increasing dependence on government programs and policies. These monthly payments were intended to improve living standards and encourage settlement in permanent communities where government services could be delivered more efficiently. However, the payments also reduced incentives for traditional subsistence activities, while creating expectations for continued government support that would influence political relationships for decades to come. The establishment of cooperative stores in many Arctic communities during the 1950s and 1960s provided access to manufactured goods while creating new forms of economic organization that combined traditional values of collective ownership with modern commercial practices. These cooperatives were typically owned and operated by community members who shared profits and decision-making responsibilities, providing alternatives to private businesses owned by outside interests. The cooperative movement enabled communities to maintain some control over their economic development while participating in broader market systems that were becoming essential for survival in the modernizing Arctic. The transformation of traditional gender roles accompanied the introduction of wage labor opportunities and modern household technologies that changed patterns of work and family responsibility. Men who had previously shared hunting and domestic responsibilities with their wives found themselves working for wages outside the home, while women assumed greater responsibility for household management and childcare in settlement environments. These changes disrupted traditional patterns of cooperative labor and decision-making that had characterized Inuit family structures for centuries, creating new forms of gender specialization that reflected European rather than traditional indigenous values. The availability of modern household appliances, including stoves, refrigerators and washing machines, reduced the time and effort required for traditional domestic tasks, while creating new dependencies on electrical power systems and repair services that were often unreliable in remote Arctic locations. These technological conveniences improved living standards in many ways, but also reduced the importance of traditional skills, including food preservation techniques, clothing manufacture, and other domestic capabilities that had been essential for Arctic survival. The technological modernization and social disruption that had accelerated during World War II created conditions that would fundamentally transform Inuit political consciousness and organizational capacity during the following decades. The concentration of previously dispersed populations in permanent settlements, combined with improved communication systems and increased contact with government officials, provided Inuit communities with new opportunities to coordinate their responses to policies, while developing collective strategies for protecting their rights and interests. The emergence of pan-Inuit political organizations during the 1960s and 1970s represented a dramatic shift from the localized resistance that had characterized earlier responses to colonial control, marking the beginning of systematic efforts to achieve self-determination and recognition of indigenous rights within existing legal and political frameworks. The formation of the Inuit Tipiriit Kanatami in 1971 represented the culmination of several years of organizational development that had begun with regional associations addressing specific local concerns. The organization emerged from a meeting of Inuit leaders from across the Arctic who recognized that their communities faced similar challenges related to land rights, resource development, and cultural preservation that required coordinated responses rather than isolated local efforts. The founding meeting, held in Ottawa with support from the Department of Indian Affairs, brought together representatives from Alaska, Northern Canada, and Greenland who shared experiences and developed strategies for advancing common interests through political advocacy and legal action. The organizational structure of Inuit Tipiriit Kanatami reflected traditional consensus-building processes while incorporating modern political techniques, including lobbying, media relations and legal advocacy that were necessary for effective engagement with government institutions and corporate interests. The organization's leadership included both traditional community leaders who possessed extensive knowledge of customary law and territorial relationships, and younger Inuit individuals who had acquired formal education and professional skills through residential schools and government programs. This combination of traditional authority and modern expertise enabled the organization to communicate effectively with government officials while maintaining legitimacy within Inuit communities. The initial priorities of Inuit Tipiriit Kanatami focused on land rights recognition, protection of traditional hunting and fishing activities, and the development of educational programs that would preserve Inuit languages and cultural knowledge while providing modern skills needed for economic development. The organization argued that Inuit peoples had never surrendered their territorial rights through treaties or other legal instruments, maintaining that traditional hunting territories remained under indigenous jurisdiction despite government claims of sovereignty over Arctic regions. This position challenged fundamental assumptions of Canadian and American territorial law while asserting indigenous rights that had been ignored during centuries of colonial expansion. The development of regional Inuit associations during the same period provided organizational infrastructure that connected local communities to broader political movements while addressing specific territorial and cultural concerns. The Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement, established in the Western Arctic during 1970, focused on land claims and resource development issues affecting Inuvialut communities in the Mackenzie Delta region. The organization documented traditional hunting territories, gathered evidence of historical occupation, and developed legal arguments supporting indigenous title to lands and resources that were being targeted for oil and gas exploration by multinational corporations. The Labrador Inuit Association, formed in 1973, addressed similar land rights issues while also focusing on the protection of traditional fishing and hunting activities that were being restricted by provincial government regulations. The association documented traditional resource management practices that had sustained Inuit communities for centuries, while arguing that these practices were more effective than government wildlife management programs in maintaining healthy animal populations. The organization also advocated for recognition of Inuit jurisdiction over coastal waters and marine resources that were essential for traditional subsistence activities. The political awakening that accompanied organizational development was facilitated by improved educational opportunities that had produced a generation of young Inuit leaders with formal training in law, business administration, and political science. Many of these individuals had experienced residential school education and possessed bilingual skills that enabled them to navigate both traditional community structures and modern political institutions. Their educational backgrounds provided technical expertise needed for land claims, research, legal advocacy, and negotiation with government representatives, while their cultural connections maintained credibility within Inuit communities. The land claims research conducted by these organizations during the 1970s involved extensive documentation of traditional territorial boundaries, seasonal hunting patterns, and customary resource management practices that had been maintained through oral traditions for centuries. Teams of researchers, including both Inuit community members and non-Indigenous anthropologists and historians, collected testimonies from elders who possessed detailed knowledge of traditional territorial relationships and historical events that demonstrated continuous occupation and use of specific areas. This research provided evidence needed to support legal arguments for Indigenous title while also preserving traditional knowledge that was being lost as older community members passed away. The mapping projects undertaken as part of land claims research represented collaborative efforts between traditional knowledge holders and modern cartographic techniques that produced detailed documentation of Inuit territorial relationships. Elders worked with researchers to identify traditional place names, seasonal camping locations, hunting territories, and travel routes that had been used by their families and communities for generations. These maps provided visual representations of complex territorial relationships that had previously existed only in oral traditions, creating documents that could be used in legal proceedings while preserving geographical knowledge for future generations. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 represented the first major legal recognition of Indigenous land rights in Arctic regions and provided a model that would influence subsequent negotiations in Canada and Greenland. The legislation was prompted by the discovery of massive oil reserves at Prudhoe Bay and the need to resolve Indigenous land claims before construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline could proceed. The act extinguished Aboriginal title to most of Alaska while providing compensation of $962 million and 44 million acres of land to be distributed among regional and village corporations controlled by Alaska Native peoples. The corporate structure established by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act created new forms of Indigenous self-governance that combined traditional community values with modern business practices. The Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, controlled by Inupiat peoples of northern Alaska, became one of the largest Indigenous-controlled businesses in North America, generating revenues through oil and gas development, government contracting, and various subsidiary enterprises. The corporation provided employment opportunities for Indigenous community members while generating profits that were used to fund cultural preservation programs, educational scholarships, and community development projects. However, the corporate model also created new forms of economic inequality within Indigenous communities as shareholders who owned corporation stock received dividend payments while community members without stock ownership had limited access to corporate benefits. The emphasis on profit maximization sometimes conflicted with traditional values of resource sharing and environmental stewardship, creating tensions between corporate management and traditional community leadership. The requirement to operate according to state and federal corporate law also limited the ability of these organizations to incorporate traditional decision-making processes and customary law into their governance structures. The environmental impact assessments required for major resource development projects provided new opportunities for indigenous communities to influence development decisions while documenting traditional ecological knowledge that had previously been ignored by government agencies and corporate planners. Inuit hunters and elders possessed detailed understanding of wildlife behavior, seasonal migration patterns, and ecosystem relationships that was essential for predicting the environmental effects of proposed developments. The inclusion of traditional knowledge in environmental assessments represented recognition of indigenous expertise while providing legal mechanisms for protecting important hunting areas and cultural sites. The James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, signed in 1975, represented the first comprehensive land claims settlement in Canada and established precedents for subsequent negotiations with other Indigenous groups. The agreement was negotiated in response to the James Bay hydroelectric project, which would have flooded vast areas of traditional Cree and Inuit hunting territories without Indigenous consent or compensation. The final settlement provided $225 million in compensation, along with guaranteed hunting and fishing rights over traditional territories and limited self-government powers for Indigenous communities. The negotiation process for the James Bay Agreement involved complex discussions about the relationship between traditional Indigenous rights and modern legal systems that would influence all subsequent land claims negotiations. Indigenous negotiators argued that their traditional territorial rights had never been extinguished by European colonization and that any development on traditional lands required Indigenous consent. Government and corporate representatives maintained that Crown sovereignty gave them authority to approve development projects while offering compensation for any impacts on Indigenous communities. The final agreement represented a compromise that recognized some Indigenous rights while allowing development to proceed under specific conditions. The hunting and fishing rights provisions of the James Bay Agreement established detailed protocols for traditional harvesting activities that balanced Indigenous subsistence needs with wildlife conservation requirements. The agreement guaranteed Inuit communities exclusive hunting rights over specified territories while establishing quotas and seasonal restrictions designed to maintain healthy animal populations. The provisions also recognized the authority of traditional hunters and community leaders to manage harvesting activities according to customary practices that had proven effective over centuries of sustainable resource use. The self-government provisions of the James Bay Agreement created new political institutions that combined elements of traditional Indigenous governance with modern administrative structures. The agreement established regional and local governments controlled by Indigenous communities with jurisdiction over education, health services, social programs, and certain aspects of natural resource management. These governments operated according to democratic principles while incorporating traditional consensus-building processes and recognizing the authority of elders and traditional leaders in community decision-making. The Nunavut Land Claims Agreement concluded in 1993 after nearly 2 decades of negotiations represented the largest Indigenous land claims settlement in Canadian history and established the foundation for the creation of Canada's newest territory. The agreement provided the Inuit of the Central and Eastern Arctic with title to 350,000 square kilometers of land, $1.1 billion in compensation payments and guaranteed participation in resource management decisions affecting traditional territories. The settlement also included provisions for the creation of Nunavut territory with a public government that would be controlled by Inuit voters due to their demographic majority in the region. The research and documentation efforts that supported the Nunavut land claim involved the most comprehensive mapping of traditional Inuit territories ever undertaken, with community members from 26 settlements providing detailed information about traditional place names, seasonal hunting patterns and historical events that demonstrated continuous occupation and use of the land. The project employed both traditional knowledge holders and professional researchers who worked together to create maps and documents that could be used in legal proceedings while preserving cultural knowledge for future generations. The negotiation process for the Nunavut Agreement required Inuit representatives to develop sophisticated understanding of Canadian constitutional law, resource management regulations and territorial governance structures while maintaining connection to traditional values and community interests. The negotiations involved complex discussions about the relationship between Indigenous rights and Canadian sovereignty, the role of traditional knowledge in resource management decisions and the structure of territorial government institutions that would serve both Inuit and non-Inuit residents of the region. The environmental protection provisions of the Nunavut Agreement established co-management systems that combined traditional ecological knowledge with modern scientific research in making decisions about wildlife management, land use planning and resource development approvals. The agreement created institutions including the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board and the Nunavut Impact Review Board that included both Inuit appointees and government representatives working together to evaluate proposed developments and establish harvesting quotas based on both traditional knowledge and scientific data. The legal battles over hunting and fishing rights that accompanied land claims negotiations involved fundamental questions about the relationship between Indigenous customary law and Canadian federal and provincial legislation. Inuit communities argued that their traditional harvesting practices were protected by Aboriginal rights that predated European colonization and could not be extinguished by government regulations. Federal and provincial governments maintained that wildlife conservation required uniform application of hunting regulations regardless of the cultural background of individual hunters. The Supreme Court of Canada's decision in R. v. Sparrow in 1990 established important precedents for the recognition of Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights while also defining the circumstances under which governments could regulate these activities for conservation purposes. The court ruled that Aboriginal rights were constitutionally protected but could be subject to reasonable regulations if governments could demonstrate that such restrictions were necessary for wildlife conservation and that they minimally impaired Aboriginal rights. The decision required governments to consult with Indigenous communities before implementing regulations affecting traditional harvesting activities and to consider alternative approaches that would achieve conservation objectives while respecting Indigenous rights. The recognition of traditional ecological knowledge in resource management decisions represented a significant shift from earlier approaches that had dismissed Indigenous knowledge as unscientific or unreliable. Inuit hunters and elders possessed detailed understanding of animal behavior, population cycles and ecosystem relationships that had been developed through centuries of careful observation and practical experience. This knowledge often provided more accurate information about local conditions than scientific studies conducted by researchers with limited experience in Arctic environments. The integration of traditional knowledge into formal resource management systems required the development of new protocols and institutions that could bridge different ways of understanding and managing natural resources. Co-management boards established through land claims agreements brought together traditional knowledge holders and scientific researchers to develop harvesting quotas, evaluate environmental impacts and monitor wildlife populations using both traditional observations and modern research techniques. These collaborative approaches often produced more effective management decisions than either traditional or scientific approaches used in isolation. The struggle for self-determination that accompanied land claim negotiations involved efforts to establish indigenous-controlled institutions that could provide government services while maintaining cultural values and traditional decision-making processes. Inuit communities sought to create governmental structures that would be accountable to community members rather than distant bureaucrats while possessing sufficient authority and resources to address local needs and priorities effectively. The establishment of Inuit-controlled governments required the development of new institutional models that could operate within existing constitutional frameworks while incorporating traditional governance practices and values. The territorial government created in Nunavut represented one approach to this challenge, establishing a public government with standard democratic institutions that would be controlled by Inuit voters due to their demographic majority. Other regions developed different models, including indigenous self-government agreements that created parallel governmental institutions with jurisdiction over specific policy areas and community members. The capacity-building efforts that accompanied political development included extensive training programs designed to prepare Inuit individuals for leadership roles in new governmental institutions. These programs provided instruction in public administration, financial management, policy development, and other technical skills needed for effective governance while also emphasizing the importance of maintaining cultural values and community accountability. The programs often combined formal classroom instruction with mentoring relationships that connected younger leaders with experienced elders and traditional authorities. The economic development strategies pursued by Inuit political organizations emphasized the importance of maintaining control over natural resources and development decisions affecting traditional territories. Rather than simply opposing all resource development, many organizations sought to negotiate agreements that would provide economic benefits to indigenous communities while minimizing environmental impacts and respecting traditional land use patterns. These approaches required sophisticated understanding of resource economics, environmental assessment processes, and corporate structures that could generate revenues while maintaining community control. The cultural preservation programs developed by Inuit organizations addressed the urgent need to document and transmit traditional knowledge that was being lost as older community members passed away and younger people adopted modern lifestyles. These programs included language education initiatives, traditional skills workshops, and cultural documentation projects that recorded traditional stories, songs, and practical knowledge for future generations. The programs often emphasized the connections between cultural preservation and political sovereignty, arguing that strong cultural identity was essential for effective self-governance and resistance to assimilationist pressures. The international networking that developed among Arctic indigenous peoples during the late 20th century would prove essential as Inuit communities confronted unprecedented environmental and social challenges that threatened the very foundations of traditional life. The accelerating pace of climate change, driven by global industrial emissions, began to manifest in dramatic alterations to Arctic ice conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife populations that had remained relatively stable for centuries. These environmental changes coincided with ongoing efforts to revitalize Inuit languages and cultural practices that had been severely disrupted by residential school policies and forced assimilation programs, creating complex challenges that required both traditional knowledge and modern technological solutions. The impact of climate change on traditional hunting practices became increasingly evident during the 1990s and accelerated dramatically in the following decades. Sea ice that had historically formed predictable patterns, allowing hunters to plan seasonal activities around reliable ice conditions, began exhibiting unprecedented variability in timing, thickness, and extent. The traditional Inuit calendar, which divided the year into 13 distinct seasons based on ice formation, wildlife behavior, and weather patterns, no longer corresponded to actual environmental conditions, as warming temperatures disrupted established cycles that had governed Arctic life for millennia. Seal hunting, which had formed the cornerstone of Inuit subsistence for over 1,000 years, faced particular challenges as changing ice conditions affected both seal behavior and hunter safety. Ringed seals, the most important subsistence species across much of the Arctic, require stable sea ice for creating and maintaining breathing holes throughout the winter months. As ice formation became delayed and ice thickness decreased, seals altered their denning patterns and breathing hole locations, making them increasingly difficult for hunters to locate using traditional techniques that had been refined over countless generations. The spring seal hunting season, traditionally the most productive period for harvesting seals basking on ice near their breathing holes, became increasingly unpredictable as ice conditions deteriorated earlier in the season and weather patterns became more volatile. Hunters who had previously been able to predict optimal hunting conditions based on traditional environmental indicators found themselves unable to plan hunting trips with confidence, as ice that appeared safe could become dangerous within hours due to rapidly changing weather conditions and unexpected warming periods. Polar bear hunting, one of the most prestigious and culturally significant hunting activities in many Inuit communities, experienced severe disruption as bear populations struggled to adapt to changing ice conditions that affected their access to seal hunting areas. Female polar bears require stable sea ice platforms for hunting seals during the critical period when they are nursing cubs and building fat reserves needed for denning. As ice-free periods lengthened and ice quality deteriorated, bear populations in many regions began declining, forcing communities to accept reduced hunting quotas or complete hunting moratoriums that eliminated important sources of food, materials, and cultural continuity. The traditional practice of ice fishing through breathing holes and constructed fishing sites became increasingly hazardous as ice thickness became unpredictable and ice quality deteriorated. Hunters who had previously been able to assess ice safety using traditional techniques developed over generations found that changing climate conditions made traditional indicators unreliable. Ice that appeared solid according to traditional assessment methods could collapse unexpectedly, creating life-threatening situations for hunters who lacked alternative safety equipment or communication systems needed for emergency rescue operations. Caribou hunting faced different but equally serious challenges as changing precipitation patterns and temperature fluctuations affected migration routes, calving success and winter survival rates for the massive herds that had sustained inland Inuit communities for centuries. Increased rainfall during winter months created ice layers on top of snow that prevented caribou from accessing vegetation beneath the snow surface, leading to starvation and population crashes that reduced hunting opportunities and forced communities to rely more heavily on imported foods that lacked the nutritional and cultural significance of traditional country foods. The timing of caribou migrations became increasingly unpredictable as changing weather patterns disrupted the environmental cues that had traditionally triggered seasonal movements between calving grounds, summer feeding areas and winter shelter locations. Hunters who had planned hunting activities around predictable migration schedules found themselves unable to intercept herds that arrived weeks earlier or later than expected, reducing hunting success and creating food security challenges for communities that depended on caribou for substantial portions of their annual protein requirements. Walrus populations experienced significant stress from changing ice conditions that affected their access to feeding areas and hauling out sites where they gathered for reproduction and social interaction. Pacific walrus populations, which had historically used sea ice as platforms for resting between feeding dives, were forced to concentrate on coastal beaches when sea ice became unavailable, leading to overcrowding that increased mortality rates among young animals and disrupted traditional hunting opportunities for Alaskan Inuit communities. The availability of traditional plant foods and materials also declined as changing temperature and precipitation patterns affected the growth and distribution of berries, medicinal plants and materials used for traditional crafts and tools. Arctic willow, which had provided essential materials for basket making and traditional medicines, experienced altered growth patterns that affected both the quantity and quality of materials available for traditional uses. Berry harvesting, an important late summer activity that provided both nutrition and social opportunities for families and communities, became less predictable as flowering and fruiting times shifted in response to changing temperature patterns. The nutritional implications of reduced access to traditional country foods extended far beyond simple caloric replacement as traditional foods provided essential nutrients including omega-3 fatty acids, iron and vitamins that were difficult to obtain from imported commercial foods available in remote Arctic communities. Marine mammals, fish and caribou had provided complete protein sources along with essential fats needed for maintaining health in cold climates, while traditional plant foods contributed vitamins and minerals that prevented nutritional deficiencies common in communities dependent on processed commercial foods. The cultural significance of hunting and food-sharing practices meant that reduced access to traditional foods affected social relationships and cultural transmission systems that had been maintained for centuries. The sharing of country foods according to traditional protocols reinforced kinship bonds, demonstrated hunting competence and provided opportunities for elders to teach younger community members about proper relationships with animals and environmental stewardship. As hunting success declined and traditional foods became less available, these cultural practices were disrupted, affecting community cohesion and the transmission of traditional values. The response to these environmental challenges involved innovative combinations of traditional knowledge and modern technology that enabled communities to adapt hunting practices while maintaining cultural connections to traditional subsistence activities. Global positioning system devices and satellite communication equipment provided new safety tools for hunters operating in increasingly unpredictable ice conditions, while traditional ice assessment techniques were modified to account for new types of ice formation and deterioration patterns that had not existed in historical experience. Weather monitoring systems that combined traditional environmental observation with modern meteorological data helped hunters make more informed decisions about when and where to hunting activities safely. Community-based monitoring programs trained local hunters to collect environmental data that was shared with climate researchers, while providing communities with better information for planning hunting activities and assessing environmental changes affecting traditional territories. The documentation of traditional environmental knowledge became increasingly urgent as changing conditions made historical knowledge less applicable to current environmental conditions, while older community members who possessed detailed environmental knowledge passed away. Community-based research projects work to record traditional knowledge about historical ice conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior that could help researchers understand the magnitude and significance of current environmental changes, while preserving cultural knowledge for future generations. Efforts to revitalize Inuit languages gained new urgency as communities recognized that language preservation was essential for maintaining cultural identity and transmitting traditional knowledge that remained relevant for contemporary challenges. The development of Inuit-controlled education systems provided opportunities to implement immersion programs and bilingual curricula that taught children in their native languages while also providing modern academic skills needed for contemporary economic and social participation. The creation of Inuktitut syllabic writing systems and standardized orthographies facilitated the development of educational materials and literature that could support language education programs in schools and communities. Publishers working with Inuit authors and educators produced children's books, textbooks, and reference materials that made Inuit languages more accessible to learners, while creating employment opportunities for translators, editors, and other language professionals within Inuit communities. Radio and television broadcasting in Inuit languages provided daily exposure to native languages for community members, while creating platforms for sharing traditional stories, contemporary news, and cultural programming that reinforced language use and cultural identity. The Inuit Broadcasting Corporation, established in 1981, produced programming in multiple Inuit dialects that reached communities across the Arctic, providing models for proper language use while entertaining and informing audiences about both traditional culture and contemporary issues. Digital technology applications, including smartphone apps, online dictionaries, and social media platforms created new opportunities for language learning and use that appealed particularly to younger community members who had grown up with modern technology. Language learning apps developed specifically for Inuit languages provided interactive lessons and practice exercises that could be accessed anywhere, while online platforms enabled speakers from different communities to connect and practice their languages together, despite geographical separation. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern educational curricula required the development of new pedagogical approaches that respected both indigenous knowledge systems and contemporary academic standards. Land-based education programs took students out of classroom settings to learn traditional skills and environmental knowledge directly from elders and experienced hunters, providing experiential learning that reinforced cultural connections while teaching practical skills needed for contemporary life in Arctic communities. Cultural camps and traditional skills workshops provided intensive learning opportunities where young people could acquire traditional knowledge, including hunting techniques, food processing methods, traditional crafts, and spiritual practices under the guidance of knowledgeable elders and cultural practitioners. These programs often combine traditional instruction with modern safety equipment and communication technology that made traditional activities safer while maintaining their cultural authenticity and educational value. The development of cultural documentation projects involving video recording, audio recording, and written transcription of traditional knowledge created permanent records that could be used for educational purposes while preserving cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost. These projects often involved collaboration between elders who possessed traditional knowledge and younger community members who had technical skills needed for operating recording equipment and managing digital archives. Economic development challenges facing contemporary Inuit communities required balancing traditional values and environmental stewardship with the need for cash income and employment opportunities that could support modern lifestyles and community services. Resource extraction projects including mining, oil and gas development, and commercial fishing operations offered potential employment and revenue opportunities but also posed risks to environmental quality and traditional land use patterns that were essential for cultural continuity. The negotiation of impact benefit agreements with resource development companies represented efforts to ensure that Inuit communities received fair compensation and employment opportunities from development projects affecting their traditional territories while maintaining some control over environmental protection and cultural site preservation. These agreements typically included provisions for local hiring preferences, training programs, and revenue sharing that provided economic benefits to communities while requiring companies to minimize environmental impacts and respect cultural values. Tourism development offered alternative economic opportunities that could showcase Inuit culture while generating employment and revenue for communities. Cultural tourism programs that featured traditional hunting demonstrations, craft workshops and storytelling sessions provided income for guides and cultural practitioners while educating visitors about Inuit history and contemporary life. However, tourism development also required careful management to prevent cultural commodification and ensure that tourism activities respected community values and privacy. The establishment of Inuit-owned businesses and cooperatives created opportunities for economic development under community control while maintaining traditional values of collective ownership and shared decision-making. These enterprises ranged from traditional craft production and commercial fishing operations to modern service businesses including construction companies, transportation services and retail operations that serve both community needs and external markets. The challenge of maintaining traditional economic activities within modern market systems required innovative approaches that could generate cash income while preserving cultural practices and environmental sustainability. Commercial hunting and fishing operations that sold traditional foods to urban markets provided income for hunters while maintaining connections to traditional subsistence activities, though these operations also required compliance with food safety regulations and marketing systems that were designed for industrial rather than traditional food production. Youth engagement in cultural preservation and political participation became increasingly important as communities recognized that cultural continuity depended on young people maintaining connections to traditional knowledge while also acquiring modern skills needed for contemporary leadership roles. Youth councils and cultural education programs provided opportunities for young people to learn about traditional governance practices while participating in contemporary political processes affecting their communities. The role of social media and modern communication technology in maintaining cultural connections created both opportunities and challenges for cultural preservation efforts. Social media platforms enabled young Inuit people to connect with peers from other communities while sharing cultural content, including traditional stories, language lessons, and contemporary artistic expressions that reinforce cultural identity across geographical boundaries. However, social media also exposed young people to outside cultural influences that could compete with traditional values and practices for their attention and loyalty. Online gaming and digital entertainment created new forms of cultural expression that combined traditional themes with modern technology, including video games that featured Inuit characters and traditional stories adapted for digital platforms. These contemporary cultural expressions provided ways for young people to engage with their cultural heritage through familiar technological formats, while also creating new forms of artistic and cultural production that reflected contemporary Inuit experiences. The development of Inuit-controlled media production facilities and training programs created opportunities for young people to acquire technical skills in video production, audio recording and digital media creation, while producing content that reflected community values and cultural perspectives. These programs often combined technical training with cultural education that helped young people understand the connections between traditional knowledge and contemporary media production techniques. The preservation of cultural identity in an increasingly globalized world required conscious efforts to maintain distinctive Inuit values and practices, while also participating in broader economic and social systems that offered opportunities for education, employment, and cultural exchange. This balance involved selective adoption of outside technologies and practices that could support community goals while rejecting influences that threatened cultural continuity or community cohesion. The establishment of cultural protocols and community guidelines for interaction with outside researchers, media representatives, and visitors helped communities maintain control over how their culture was represented and shared with external audiences. These protocols typically emphasize the importance of community consent, accurate representation, and respect for cultural sensitivities, while providing frameworks for beneficial collaboration with outside partners who could support community goals. The integration of traditional governance practices with modern political institutions created hybrid systems that combined democratic participation with consensus-building processes and elder consultation that reflected traditional decision-making practices. These governance innovations provided models for other indigenous communities while demonstrating that traditional political practices could be adapted to contemporary circumstances without losing their essential characteristics. As Inuit communities navigate the complex challenges of the 21st century, they continue to demonstrate the resilience and adaptability that enable their ancestors to thrive in the Arctic for over a millennium. The combination of traditional knowledge with modern technology, the revitalization of indigenous languages alongside participation in global communication networks, and the development of sustainable economic opportunities that respect both cultural values and environmental stewardship represent ongoing efforts to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The success of these efforts will determine whether future generations of Inuit people will be able to maintain their distinctive cultural identity and connection to Arctic lands that have sustained their communities for countless generations, ensuring that the rich heritage of Inuit civilization continues to evolve and flourish in an uncertain but hopeful future.